Hello, everyone. Welcome to Moving Minds. My name is Aarti, and I work at Swan Foundation. For those of you who are joining our first Moving Minds, let me just introduce White Swan. We are an organization based in Bangalore, and for the last 6 years, we've been working on disseminating knowledge on mental health and raising awareness for mental health. We have been in the last couple of months doing multiple sessions surrounding topics on mental health to help people cope with it at this unprecedented time. Today, we have brought 9 panelists to discuss the topic of women and abuse at home. We understand that it's a very difficult topic for most people to sit through. So we feel free to drop off if any part of this symposium happens to be triggering for you or anybody else who's watching. Remember that we will be publishing this as soon as the symposium ends, and you can catch live tweets of the event on our Twitter handle. The credentials are at the rate mental health IND. Um, we are also putting out a schedule, which you might be able to see on your comments section. This will help you understand which portions of the symposium might be difficult to watch and which ones might be easier for you, and you can tune in for those. I would like to introduce all our panelists at the beginning before we move forward. It's going to be a 3-hour session. So just so that you know who is speaking at which point, it would be great if I could have all the panelists at once so that you all have an idea of whom you'd be speaking. I'll just give them a minute to tune in. All right. So the first session for today would be about explaining why we're here. What is domestic abuse? Why are we here to talk about it? I will be doing a short presentation on that so that all of you, we can set the tone for today's symposium after understanding what this issue is and why it requires the importance that it has. This will be followed by a keynote address by renowned feminist activist Kamla Basin. Kamlaji will be talking to you for some time, followed by a session on narrative by a session called Narrative by Shruti Sharda, who will be speaking to giving talking to you about her story, followed by a presentation in understanding the legal reality of domestic violence. So you would know about how to navigate the law, what is it that the law can offer you. This will be done by Meghna and Bhumika of Shakti. This will then be followed by a panel discussion moderated by Pavitra of White Swan Foundation. The panel will be on why women don't just leave relationships that are abusive. This panel has 4 people. That has Anuradha Kapoor from Swan, Kirti Jaikumar, Dr. Aishwarya, and Shruti. Following which, we will be doing a Q&A on caring for your mental health as a survivor of abuse. I will be speaking with Dr. Aishwarya on this. Finally, a panel discussion on the role of a bystander, moderated by Ranjita, my colleague from White Swan Foundation. And the panel will have Anika and Madhumita. So we hope you are able to find able to stay through all the 3 hours. If you're not, don't worry, you can drop in at any point and also catch the live tweets on our Twitter handle. So we'll begin by just a short understanding on why we're here and why it's important to talk about domestic abuse. So just to start by looking at what does domestic abuse look like. All of us have always known of domestic abuse to have been physical and have always looked at abuse as something where you can see the signs, like it's a physical injury. The thing is, though, that abuse is so much more than that. It comes in many different forms, and it's extremely important for us to have an understanding of what these different kinds of abuse are. This will essentially help us create safer spaces to also recognize the signs if we are ever going through or somebody else is ever going through the situation. So without going into too many details on what these are, I'm just going to briefly explain every single point over here. The first being physical abuse. Physical abuse generally refer to behaviors that cause body pain or physical danger to somebody's life. So this could include acts like slapping or beating or the use of weapons. This constitutes physical abuse. The other kind of abuse is verbal or emotional abuse. Verbal and emotional, actually, it could be either. These are behaviors that are deliberately aimed to degrade or destroy the self-esteem of a person. In this case, a person is often subject to name calling, to being ignored by their partner or the family member, or to have threats of violence against them. So it's very it puts a lot of this act has an effect on a person's self-esteem. The third one is financial abuse. Financial abuse is when a person has been denied access to money by the person who's abusing them, or any of the financial resources that is owed to them. A person has the right to have certain amount of money with them, which is when it's denied, it constitutes a financial abuse. And finally, sexual abuse. Sexual abuse refers to behaviors of sexual nature that degrade or humiliate or violate a person and cause injury to them. Moving on, this brings us to really understanding what domestic abuse really is. Domestic abuse is a pattern of abusive behavior that is displayed by a person living in a domestic setup where they physically and mentally harm or threaten to harm a person within the household. So, in most cases, domestic abuse is done to exercise power or control over another person. A person can face abuse from anyone. It could be from a spouse, a partner, their in-laws, or anybody in their family. It's often associated with increased isolation from the outside world, limited personal freedom, and accessibility to resources. And the risk of abuse of a survivor, for a person who's going through it, often is greatest when they are cut off from their support networks. So in the next, we are looking at who is at risk. Now, domestic abuse can affect anyone, irrespective of their identity. It's important to know that any person can experience domestic abuse, and their situation depends on who they're living with and what happens then. However, there are some vulnerable groups of people who are at a higher risk of experiencing this abuse. These could include people from the LGBTQIA plus community, women, elderly people, people with disabilities, or even children. Currently, however, the law provides relief only in situations where the aggrieved person is a woman, and women can access recourse for domestic abuse under the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act 2005. Understanding this legal reality is a presentation that the team from Shakti will do later. So if anybody has any questions on the legalities around this, it is something we can look at later. One thing with domestic abuse is that it's important to look at these issues faced by every single one of these groups from the unique lens that they come from. So an intersectional approach to domestic abuse is extremely important to ensure that a person can be taken to safety or is remaining in a safe situation. So to understand the prevalence of this issue, it is to know that in India, 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence. The National Family Health Survey in 2015 had found this. So this goes to say how much of an issue domestic abuse is in India, and how it needs our importance, and why we need to have larger conversations about this. So considering the need to look at domestic violence from a more holistic approach, we at White Swan Foundation realized that only talking about one aspect of it would not be enough, which is why we've brought such an eminent panel of people to touch upon the different aspects that define the survivor's experience when it comes to domestic violence. This is including the social aspect of it, the personal struggle a person might go through, the legal aspect, and the bystander's role. All of this coming together, including the how domestic violence has an effect on a person's mental health. This is the reason why it's a 3-hour seminar, and which is why we hope that all of you are able to get the experience that you have come for when you join the session. Like I said at the beginning, and I'd like to reiterate at this point, that we understand that this is a topic that is difficult for people, especially sitting through 3 hours of it. So if you feel like dropping off at any point, if the content is triggering for you, please feel free to log off. And remember that we have posted a schedule on the comment section and on our Facebook page. So if you want to access that information, you can go there and find out which session would be more comfortable for you to join. The other few things we wanted to tell you is that we will be live tweeting this event on our Twitter. The handle is on the screen for you to see with the hashtag trauma and mental health. We are also live blogging the event on our portal, www.whiteswanfoundation.org. One thing to remember is that if you have any comments or questions, please feel free to post them in the comment section in the Facebook Live. We hope that the comments are kept without revealing personal details of survivors to protect their privacy. In case you have a question that you'd like to ask anonymously and find it difficult to post it on a public Facebook comment section, we will be posting a Google form link on the comment section where you can anonymously ask your question. Someone from our team will pass it on to the panelists, and we will ask them for you during one of our conversations with them. So we hope that this is a great symposium for everyone, and you have a great experience and learn a lot about this. So let's move on. I would like to introduce our keynote speaker, Kamla Bhasin. Kamla ji doesn't really require any introduction. She is a renowned feminist activist and has been actively engaged with issues related to development, gender, education, and media since 1970. Just when we were starting, she was talking about how it's been so many years of working in this field, and it's wonderful. She is currently the advisor of Sangat and Jagori, based in Delhi, and as the South Asia coordinator of 1 Billion Rising, a global campaign to end violence against women and girls. She has written extensively on many topics, including gender, women's empowerment, participatory, and sustainable development. Thank you so much for joining us, Kamlaji. Over to you.
So friends, the Indian Constitution, Zindabad, equality, Zindabad, and love, Zindabad. The organizers of this symphony have asked me to give the keynote. I do hope my keynote will not spoil the orchestra in any way. And if it does, I already apologize. But the idea is really just to honestly share a few thoughts of mine and to make some general points, because the other concrete points will be made by all the panelists. And guess what? I want to begin with a Sanskrit mantra. I've never done this before. And it says, Om Purnamada Purnamidam Purnat Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnameva Vashishyate. It says the Creator, our Creator, is Purn, whole. Those of us who are created are Purn, whole. If you take Purn out of Purna, Purna remains. What does it mean? It means that we parents are whole, but so are our children. Our husband is whole, but so is the wife. The employer at home is home, but so is the domestic worker. The teacher is Purna, but so is the disciple. So this was the original design of the world. But what is the reality today? In the context of our webinar, the reality is that patriarchy and gender do not allow anybody to remain Purna. Gender divides us into two, makes us incomplete, non-whole, it makes us dependent, it makes us unhappy. Nobody, neither a female nor a male, is allowed to be Purna. And I think that is where the problem begins. So in patriarchy, we look at children and say, hey, you are superior and you inferior. You cannot cry and you cannot laugh loudly. You are the mind. You are the brain. You are rational. You are the body, often impure, dirty. You are not the mind. You are the subject. You can decide what you want to do. You are just an object, a colony of the subject, etc., etc., etc. So two incomplete halves, one given power and the other deprived of whatever power she was born with. Capitalist patriarchy and religion and culture do this halving, this breaking up of human beings all our lives. And friends, it's not just patriarchy which does it. Caste, class, race, heteronormativity does it too. It divides complete people who have a choice, who should be free to decide what they are, who they are, but they are not allowed. Those who are superior, they are considered to be the subjects, the rulers. Those, as I said, who are inferior are bodies. Those who are the mind are the white collar people, not dirty at all. They don't work with their bodies. And they can be paid 10 times, 20 times, 50 times, 100 times more than those whose collars are blue, dirty, who work with their bodies. These hierarchies, because they are unjust, they need violence. So I'm not at all surprised that there is violence against women, there's violence against Dalits, against the blacks, against LGBTIQ, against anyone who has to be kept in her place. In this system, some of us can be sitting here and doing our webinars, increasing our creativity, whereas millions in the country may be dealing with hunger, joblessness, etc. For some, which is women, in the last few months, 20% increase in violence on them. In 1 billion rising, we say 1 out of 3 women are dealing with violence. So we said 1 billion women. So in the last 3-4 months, 200 million more women are facing violence, or the same women are facing more violence. And yet, patriarchy, caste, class, race are not considered deadly viruses. There is no lockdown about these deadly viruses which are continuing for over 2,000, 3,000 years, and race for over 500 years. Patriarchy's violence. UNFPA came out with a report a few weeks ago saying 140 million women are missing in the world. And the word missing means they have been killed because of socio-cultural reasons. How many? 140 million. COVID-19 has not yet killed a million. No labs are looking for any vaccines for this deadly virus called patriarchy. My second point is home, which features in the title of our webinar today. About home, George Bernard Shaw said, "A happy family is but an earlier heaven," meaning before we die, there'll be the real heaven. This one is heaven on earth. People tell us all the time, don't go out. You are not safe there. At home, you are safe. We talk of Asian family values, Indian family values, but all statistics tell us how safe our homes are. Bernard Shaw says family is heaven, whereas I wrote a song 25 years ago in which I said about the family, कौन कहता है जन्नत से, हमसे पूछो जो घर में फंसे, ना हिफाजत ना इज्जत मिली, कर कर कुर्बानी हम मर गए, दुश्मनों की जरूरत किसे, जुल्म अपनों ने हम पर किए, घर के अंदर भी घर मिटना है, तो संभालो ये घर, हम चले. So दोस्तों, we know how 1/3 of all women are facing violence. And my third point is that I would really like to talk not just of women and abuse at home. I would like to talk about men, women, children, and abuse at home. For how much longer will we leave men out? For how much longer will we not speak of children who are the direct sufferers, even if only the women are being abused? I believe it's not just women. Everyone is in a mess. Everyone in a violent home. Men are often perpetrators of violence, but many boys and some gentlemen are also abused. Sexual abuse of boys is a lot, but because of patriarchy, they cannot talk about it. Men are related to the women who are victims of violence. And I know that some men also face emotional violence at home. So men are part of the problem. And I believe men will have to be part of the solution. Both women and men and transgender people, all of us together will have to fight patriarchy and say loudly and clearly that patriarchy is messing up everybody. Friends, I really believe, and I've spoken about it a lot, that patriarchy messes up boys and men also in many, many ways. Yes, patriarchy gives them power, it gives them entitlements, but it also dehumanizes them. It also puts them into boxes. If there was no gender, there will be no transgender people. If there was no patriarchy and the desire to continue our families through male heir, there will not be this criminalization of homosexuality. So friends, we really need to include children and men, both when we are discussing the problem, they as perpetrators. I know that most of the perpetrators are men. But friends, even if one man is suffering domestic violence, for me, a feminist, even that is not acceptable. So I think I would like to talk about men and particularly children. And I want to add that most boys and men who suffer sexual violence, they suffer at the hands of other men, not at the hands of women normally. Women abuse other women. We all know it, and we are told every time we open our mouth, औरत औरत की दुश्मन है. The infamous mother-in-law. But which mother-in-law? There are two mothers-in-law. The mother of the bridegroom and the mother of the bride. Which one is the one who does violence? All of us know it. The mother of the bridegroom. That means she's not doing it because she's a woman. She's doing it because she's patriarchal. She's behaving in a patriarchal way. Patriarchy is ordering her to do it. I come to my next point. Friends, for intersectional feminists, having said whatever I have said, the real task is humongous. The real task is to get rid of patriarchy, caste, class, race, heteronormativity, and neoliberal capitalism. Now, since this is a huge task, what we do, we start our little organizations and deal with little problems instead of taking on the real issues. So we do what we call in Hindi, mallam patti. We do patch up. We put band-aid where surgery is required. So I really feel that we need to think about it. Look at my story. For 50 years, I've been doing this work on development, on gender equality, on peace, on human rights, etc. 50 years, amazing work by Kamla Bhasin, her poetry, her songs, her books. But what is the result of her 50-year-long work? The sex ratio has consistently come down. Female-male ratio has consistently come down in the 50 years that me and my organizations have been working. Violence against women is not less. Rapes are much more brutal and not less. The percentage of women in paid work has been coming down. Economic inequalities have become hundreds and hundreds of times more. The environment, not just the ecological environment, the social, the human rights environment, the cultural and political environment has become much more fragile. Therefore, friends, I really feel we feminists, which includes women, men, transgender people, we need to rethink. And I am going to talk now in my last few minutes about a few things which I feel need a lot of attention. Of course, we need better implementation of laws. We need better police, better medical care, better courts, better service providers, etc. But I feel much more than these things, which all of them come after violence has taken place, after injustice has been done. I feel much more work on prevention and preventive measures. What to do? Number one, I think we actually need a cultural revolution to look at our religions, to look at our cultures, to look at our media, and to look at the resulting mindset. This is where a lot more work is required. Because for us feminists, the personal is the political, we should begin with ourselves. We should look at our own lives and see, is patriarchy still hiding somewhere in my speech, in the way I behave with other people, in the way I make use of my class provided to me by my patriarchal marriage? We need to work within the families much more, friends, with adults, with elderly people, and with children. Within the families, three very important things. We try and do no gendering, no telling children, you are a girl, you are a boy. Allow them the freedom. Purna, they are purna. Why are you making them half? He can be rational and emotional. She can be rational and emotional. So why break your children into halves? Give them freedom. Allow them to choose, to decide what they want to wear. Second, friends, care work, service work at home should be for both girls and boys, men and women. Not because women's workload needs to be lowered, but because family needs to become a partnership. And mainly because I feel this is the way to make boys and men gentle, caring, and loving. We women have no special glands which makes us look after other people. It is practice. So the slogan is, माँ का ही क्यों लेते नाम, घर का काम है सबका काम. Care work is everyone's work. And friends, my next point within the family, property for her. Girls and daughters need to be given property, and enough research exists that women who have any property face much less violence. So the slogan there is, Beti dil mein, beti will mein. Beti dil mein, beti will mein, na दहेज na महंगी शादी, बेटी को देंगे property आधी. And friends, my next point is larger campaigns. Like today, so many of us are together from so many organizations. Much more feminist solidarity with all kinds of groups so that we can take on the corporate sector, we can take on the capitalist patriarchy, we can remind people that there is an Indian constitution, there is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which says all human beings are born equal and free with dignity and rights. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Kamlaji. That was absolutely wonderful and such a powerful speech. Thank you. Moving to our next session, it's next session is called Narratives, and I would like to introduce our speaker, Shruti Sharda. Shruti is a gender-based violence activist and an award-winning queer feminist writer. She's also a communication strategist, a former journalist, and community media person. She currently is a consultant with the Urgent Action Fund for Women and Human Rights. Over to you, Shruti.
Thank you so much. Very happy to be here to share my narrative, and also very happy that I'm coming after some sort of context setting has happened. I would like to start with an introduction to what I'm doing today, like what I'm speaking about. So I'm 34 today. I've had a longish journey of escaping the most serious form of violence that I was facing. And it has been about 6 years since that has happened. So you can imagine that it has been a bit of a journey of healing, of getting to a place where I want to be, unlearning behaviors and trauma, etc. So why I felt necessary to say that is today, through my narrative, what I'm doing is I'm looking back at my life. It is very difficult to encapsulate more than half my life in like 10-15 minutes, but I'll try. And because this is a conversation about abuse, it is even more difficult because my early childhood, my teenage years, and my early adulthood were dominated by one particular personality who was abusive in every sense of the word. Now, as the initial presentation set forth, that the abuse can be of different forms. And unfortunately for me, and especially for my mother, who was the, so to say, primary victim in this household, we were subjected to every form of abuse that is imaginable. So let me sort of paint a picture as to how the situation was. And this is especially important because a lot of the time when the conversation about domestic violence, about abuse, be it emotional, physical, or of any other sort, it comes up, the conversation tends to veer towards why didn't she leave? Why didn't they leave? Or what stopped her from leaving? And questions of that sort. That is a question we are going to address in panel that is to come soon. So I intend to, through my narrative, sort of set a context for it. So I grew up in a home which was in a small town. Again, that's an important factor in my reality because I was surrounded by conversations which did not talk about abuse at all. Talking about abuse is probably a big expectation because it didn't even acknowledge abuse. So no matter where I was staying, be it in a flat or a bungalow, no matter how the surrounding was, whether the buildings were close or far off, nobody could hear this sound. Nobody could hear the screams. Nobody could hear any of the halchal that was happening in a house constantly. When I say nobody could, what I mean is nobody wanted to. Imagine being raised like that. Imagine growing up like that. And then you get a sort of a sense of the suffocation and the frustration and the helplessness of this household. So when I was growing up, when I started sort of understanding my mother's reality, slowly the stories came out that she had been facing severe abuse almost from the first day of her marriage. She was continuing to face severe abuse even when she was pregnant with me. So she always used to sort of tell me that you came out prepared for a situation. Um, there has been recent research which has pointed to certain behavioral and in fact even DNA changes that the fetus can undergo if in utero there is some experience of abuse, especially to the person who is pregnant. I'm not sure, I cannot validate that point, but that is a research. The point being that violence, direct or indirect, can have catastrophic, life changing, sometimes DNA changing effects on you. So that's how I was born. I was born into a household where I probably was wired to expect violence. I was wired to expect lack of control. As I was growing up, every single day was a struggle. If you have been a person ever in your life who has asked this question, why didn't she leave? Let me sort of explain how everyday life is. Everyday life is an existence where you do not have control. And the perpetrator or the perpetrators in your house, depending on your situation, are the ones who yield control. So it was in our household in the sense that if the perpetrator in the house, who was my father, woke up and was in a bad mood, the mandate of the house was that everybody should be in a bad mood. Especially nobody should laugh or have a good time because he was in a bad mood. This is the situation and the reality of abuse that a lot of persons who have been fortunate enough to not undergo abuse do not understand. That it's not just dramatic incidents that define abuse, it is the everyday slow burn, every look, every walk, every turned face, every fear of a slap, every risk or threat of any sort of violence that adds to the abuse. This is also abuse. This slow burning fear that you constantly walk with, that you are constantly walking on eggshells. You don't know what you will say or what you will do or what may be imagined that may lead to some form of abuse. So this is how you live every single day. Because you do not have any control whatsoever, are never sure of yourself. I remember that I used to be a good student, so as to speak, in the sense that I would score well. I participated in competitions, we won awards, and I was generally appreciated. And I think I was looked at as being a student who should have her life sorted out and, had a good plan for her life. But the truth couldn't be farther from what it was, because I was absolutely unsure of everything in my life. Because right from the point I was born, the, the communication that I received, the messaging that I received from my house was, I was nothing, that I was zero, that I could not control my life at all, that even if what the other person is appreciating me for is not really appreciation, that I don't really deserve it, or that I should not, feel too proud about it. So basically, your mind and how it functions is in fact in the hands of someone else, much more powerful, much more whimsical, much more cruel. So what a lot of people who are looking from outside in don't realize is it's an extremely cruel place to be in. You know, you do not get to relax. You do not get to have a happy day on your own terms. You do not get to enjoy an achievement on your own terms. Everything is decided by the perpetrator. So for me, by the time I was 18 and it was a chance for me to go out and study, and thankfully I had gotten through a college which was outside of the state. So this was the first time I could get out of the house. You can imagine how lonely I felt, how completely clueless I was, because here I was physically grown up, but completely unaware of what I am, what I can do, what I stand for, what my real personality is. I don't know anything. I do not want to go into the details and nuances of the kind of abuse we faced and we saw, especially because it was my mother facing most of it and it is her story to tell. Um, I am going to talk about how I, as a daughter, as a product of a household of this sort, where verbal abuse was very common against the children, though physical abuse wasn't, how it affected us so strongly, and how the fact that you saw your mother facing extreme cruelty, extreme physical violence, how that affected you very strongly. So by the time I was 18 and I was in college, it is an exciting time. Generally, it is considered an exciting time because you're on your own. You get your allowance, you can live the way you want to. It was terrifying time for me because it is how every abuse victim or survivor feels. It is the first time that freedom is tasted and freedom feels scary. Freedom is scary because you do not know what to do with it. You have never experienced it. You don't know how it functions, what the responsibilities are. Even if I had a completely unconditional sort of freedom in my hands, I would not know what to do with it because I had never experienced it. So, for every survivor and every victim, the biggest challenge while coming out into the world is to start from zero, start learning things in terms of how to cope with the world, what to do with yourself, look at oneself in the mirror and realize that, okay, this is what I see and this is what I have been led to believe is me. But is that me? I'm not sure. So for me, what started at 18 was this long drawn process of realizing what the real me is, what all factors I have to unlearn, what all sort of behavior patterns I didn't need anymore. And then it was time again for me to come back home and break up the marriage that was the basis of all the violence. So what I had unlearned over the few years, I had to sort of go back and sort of take it back on because here was a time for action. So what a lot of people unfortunately do not understand about violence is how it completely saps you from all your energy, all your positivity, and how constantly you are the one responsible for it. You are the one responsible for talking about violence you're the one responsible for dealing with people who are doubting your story. You're the one responsible for dealing with misogynistic statements made at the police station. You're the one responsible for restarting your life. You're the one responsible for figuring out your life. The point is, nobody understands what level of mental labor it involves to even restart, if at all you get the opportunity to restart. I know it is a long winding, complicated story because abuse stories are always long winding and complicated. It is near impossible for me to have a straight-laced strategic speech on abuse because so much has happened and so much is intersecting. It is very, very difficult. So what I want to end with is, it is never a straight line. It is never black and white, no matter who the perpetrator is. It is never a linear path towards healing. It is not the easiest subject to understand. And it is absolutely wrong to ask, why didn't you leave? Imagine being in a household where even breathing can be a problem. Imagine being in a household where you sometimes don't even buy your own clothes. Imagine being in a household where if you happen to drop a glass of water by accident, you will hear a scolding for 4 hours straight. Imagine living in a household like that. Imagine how much control you have, how much decision making power you have, how much confidence you have in yourself. You don't. So to look from outside in and judge someone on the basis of your own self-confidence is wrong, because your self-confidence is not the self-confidence the survivor has. So anytime that you are engaging with someone who has unfortunately been a victim or a survivor and are looking to support them, please understand that it is more about listening than pontificating. You have to listen, you have to understand the situation. Because the truth is, even though I am a survivor, and it was not just the domestic violence that I faced. It was also like other forms of violence that I faced later in my life. That does not mean that I'm going to understand another survivor, another victim's story completely. I also have to listen. There is no template for it. There is no textbook for it. Every situation is different because issues are intersecting. My intersecting issues included and continue to include my caste, my class, the way I look, the education I've had, and a lot of other things. So no survivor is the same as the other survivor. No victim is the same as the other victim. So if the conversation is about how we create a society where abuse itself seems so reprehensible that it doesn't happen, we have to first understand the nuances of abuse, not just as a police person or as a person involved in the justice system, but as people in general, as bystanders, as neighbors who refuse to acknowledge that that house, there is something happening. All of us are responsible for this. And I feel you can look at me today. I have struggled and I continue to struggle with so many things, be it insomnia, be it PTSD, so many other things, you know. But so much of that effort had to be individual because there is no infrastructure in society available for you. So you're alone. You're alone at home and you're alone after you get out. You are responsible for so much that you have to do. Just imagine the amount of mental labor you have to do to get to where you want to be. Have empathy and compassion towards survivors. If you don't have that, if that is not your starting point, you will never understand abuse and you will continue to ask questions like why you didn't leave. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Shruti. I think I speak for all of the audience when I say that, it must have been immensely difficult to dig into your story and put this into perspective for all of us. When I asked Shruti to do this for us, she said I'm not very, not very pro, using the survivor story as the way forward. And, but she's just, not only she's doing work, in healing, but she's also helping others heal and working in this space that must be quite difficult. And I think I speak for everyone when I say thank you so much and for doing this. This is immensely difficult. Please do take a break before you come into
Sure. Thank you so much.
So on that note, I think both Kamlaji and Shruti have sort of set the tone on the complexities, and I don't think we need to really go into why we chose to have such a such a wide range of panelists and why we want to cover every angle that surrounds domestic abuse. Our next set of speakers come from an organization called Shakti. Meghna Chandra and Bhumika Sahni will be making a presentation on the legal realities in India and what really are we dealing with when it comes to domestic abuse. What can we expect? What can we not expect? But just a quick introduction of the two speakers. First, Meghna. Meghna Chandra founded Shakti, and it's a non-profit committed to increasing access to justice in India through technology. She worked as an international trade and project finance lawyer for several years before switching careers to research and policy. Meghna will be accompanied by Bhumika, who is a social worker and consultant with Shakti. Bhumika is a gold medalist who studied social work from TIS, Mumbai, and has worked with several nonprofits, government and international agencies on issues pertaining to children's and women's rights. Over to Meghna and Bhumika. Your voice is you.
Thanks, Pavitra. I'm going to be sharing my screen to begin. Please let me know if everything's working so far. Okay. To begin with, I think I'd like to say thank you to White Swan for organizing this initiative, and also to Shruti for sharing her story, as well as Kamlaji for providing a great introduction. Our goal in this presentation is to understand the legal realities in addressing domestic violence. When we say legal realities, we're going to be focusing on access to justice, which is the nature of the work that Shakti does. And we hope to also make the case for a more user-centered approach. So as we've already heard, 1 in 3 married women in India report domestic violence. Just a point to note here that this is the reported domestic violence. So there's a lot that goes unreported. 9 out of 10 women, though, don't seek any form of help. And only 4% of women facing violence actually seek help from formal sources, such as the legal system or the police. So clearly, women aren't accessing our legal system or the police as much as they possibly could. And so our goal in this presentation is to really address the complexities and the frailties of the legal system and how it approaches domestic violence. We'll be discussing structural barriers, myths that have arisen in relation to the legal system, and briefly touch upon recommended best practices. So to begin with, we thought we'd address how the system has responded to the need for domestic violence related legislation. So in the 1960s, for instance, there was no formal solution specifically catering to domestic violence related issues. So if women or other people facing violence went to the police, essentially the only provisions that the police could use would be Chapter 16 of the Indian Penal Code about offenses against the human body. They could go to a lawyer and essentially petition for divorce, but these were the main solutions that were available. As is apparent to us now, the legislature did realize that this was inadequate. And they attempted to pass a few legislations regarding dowry harassment, which proved to be largely ineffective. Then they finally passed Section 498A in the 80s. Now, Section 498A allowed the police to essentially file, to have a process in relation to domestic violence. While most of us know Section 498 to be a dowry-related harassment provision, it also includes within its ambit extreme cruelty, which in effect also includes domestic violence. And so even if you go to the police today, what they can do is to file an FIR under Section 498A and conduct a police investigation. And the only form of relief you could possibly get in this process is to have your abuser imprisoned. This is the criminal process that is present in our in the scope of our legislation today. Let's say you didn't want to adopt a criminal process and instead you wanted to go down the civil process, that is family law and other civil remedies like money and shelter and custody related issues. Before, what you could do was to essentially file for divorce under the grounds of cruelty. And you would get permanent relief in the form of maintenance, that is alimony, or custody. But again, this wasn't adequate because it didn't address the domestic violence itself. And so after much lobbying by extremely great advocacy organizations, the Domestic Violence Act came into being. Now this kind of created an additional process. This process focuses on the role of a protection officer and nonprofits in helping women file petitions under the Domestic Violence Act and connecting them to lawyers and legal aid to provide temporary relief in the form of money, shelter, protection, and custody. So the goal of the domestic violence legislation was to marry both approaches in the sense that it provided for civil remedies, but also had the benefit of criminal enforcement, and therefore when orders were violated. And therefore, this legislation was hoped would essentially solve some of the problems that existed before. Historically, we know that as we're not good predictors of the fragilities and the behavior that comes from, deploying a law in the real world. And so other complications arose. As we can see here, this is a very provider-centric approach as opposed to a user-centric approach. So in theory, it works great, but in reality, there are other issues that arise. So in terms of accessing justice, when people go to police stations, they're often told that this is not the right police station to come to. For instance, in Bangalore city, it's recommended that they go to a Mahila police station to file a domestic violence complaint. There are only 2 Mahila police stations in the whole Bangalore urban district. So it's hard to get to. They expect women to get to this police station. And once, if the woman happens to reach the police station, the process is not easy then either. They're often told to undergo mandated counseling, either by the police themselves or through a counseling center. This process can take sometimes weeks or months, as we've heard. And so it's not something that women can easily navigate and file an FIR if necessary. If they want to avoid this process of mandated counseling, they'd probably need to find a lawyer. But lawyers are not easy to find either. Lawyers in India are not ethically allowed to advertise. And so finding the contact details of lawyers means relying on proximate knowledge. So relying on your friends and family to tell you how to find a lawyer. And so this reliance essentially makes it hard to navigate that process, especially due to the stigma in relation to domestic violence. So if you chose instead to go to a protection officer, you'd have to find one. And finding one is hard because the lists of protection officers are often outdated and they're only available online or in the courts or in the women's state commissions. So they're not easily accessible. So keeping this in mind, we thought we'd address a few more structural barriers, one being legal aid. We have been told that from women who try to access legal aid are often referred to empanel lawyers who then, essentially ask them to meet them at their private law firms and therefore charge them for money. So it's not a viable process and it needs more oversight. In terms of infrastructure, domestic violence petitions are filed in courts where there aren't considerations for practical realities like childcare, which, for instance, family courts have. There's also limited access to information. Stakeholders such as the police, we found, don't often know what they're supposed to do in situations. They need more guidance as well. And survivors also have limited access to information because they don't know what solutions they can get at which provider. Furthermore, as we all know, there are delays in accessing the courts and in processing cases. This is also enhanced by the fact that lower courts often need more guidance in interpreting new legislation, and the Domestic Violence Act is relatively new. And therefore, these cases might take much longer. Now, I will be handing it over to my colleague, Bhumika Sahani, to talk about the myths in relation to the legal system.
Thank you, Meghna. In addition to the structural barriers that Meghna just told us about, there are also this dangerous myth that women routinely hear, and we've also heard on the field, saying that women misuse the domestic cruelty law, and these laws are unfair to men, and they can break the family. There's also this question that many, even in power, ask that why are these legislation only women-centric? Why there's so many legislations like that? I feel these reactions are in some way oversimplification of the larger problem and the issue, and not really looking at the essence and application of the law. Such views, unfortunately, have been able to impact the judiciary, and there have been instances where the law has been diluted and weakened because of these petitions that were filed. There is this narrative, and then there are these statistics in front of you from the National Crime Bureau. The crime against women has been consistently rising over the past 4 years. And within these numbers, the cruelty by husband or his family has been the largest proportion. Now, these figures, as we know, and these are the reported figures, these are only the tip of the iceberg, because we've also been discussing in the symposium until now that how underreporting of domestic violence is a reality and is an established fact. Many women often don't recognize, don't acknowledge the abuse, let alone go and report it. One of the biggest reasons cited to argue that these laws are misused is the fact that there is low conviction rate. While I feel that misuse of law is something which is possible in any legal domain, a low conviction rate in this case can be a result of many problems. It could be because of inadequate investigation or the patriarchal mindset of the people who are actually investigating the case, or they're passing these judgments. Agreed that there are some people who might be misusing the law, but that percentage is so low. It becomes a problem, I feel, when this becomes the larger public narrative and it dilutes the larger discussion around violence against women. It is then imperative to look at these numbers as, to look at beyond these numbers, to look at the issue with a more larger lens, because there are definite societal factors that propagate violence against women and push women into silence. I also wanted to spend some time talking about some best practices that can ensure legal relief and a more holistic approach towards domestic violence. Speaking from a legal perspective, evidence is something that can really come in handy and help a woman who's facing domestic violence and wants to go the legal route. It's not an absolute necessity because of the risk that women can face in case they go about collecting evidence. But there are a lot of ways in which she can do that. She can maintain a log of the incident to say what happened, who was around, what was the incident like, and make sure that it's kept in a safe place and can be used as evidence later. Another important point I feel is getting all the stakeholders like police, the lawyers, the NGOs who work on the ground level, the crisis intervention team, all of them together to engage with each other. Because even if we have, I feel, well-functioning and empathetic systems, but if they work in silos and they're not interacting with each other and they're not sharing their knowledge, there is no interdependency or reliance, the larger purpose doesn't get solved. Linked with this point is also a very important need to have standardized documents. And this is something that a lot of women and experts on the field have told us, that how the fear of telling your story over and over again and the fear of re-traumatization discourages women to seek help, especially legal help. Why not then have a system in place where there's standardization of documents so that the woman doesn't have to tell her story to every new person she meets? Another thing which I want to highlight is the impact on children. I feel this is overlooked in terms of what is the impact of legal procedure on children. I remember I was working in a family court in Bombay, and I cannot forget the fear, the anger, the uncertainty that children would experience as part of the legal process in divorce or custody cases. We really need more sensitivity and, most importantly, child-friendly procedures to address the impact of violence and their involvement in the legal process and what it can mean for them. I also wanted to briefly touch upon the roles of mental health professionals when it comes to legal system. As mental health professionals, your reports and documentation can prove very helpful for the woman who's facing abuse. Documenting what the woman is telling you in verbatim, or making notes of non-verbal responses, like did she appear agitated, was she angry? All of this can be used as evidence that can help her. Just a couple of things to keep in mind is avoid summarizing, for example, by saying that she is a victim of domestic violence, because if there's no accompanying factual information, it might not be considered valid in the court. As a mental health professional, your involvement in the legal process, I would say, it's a very delicate space, because your evidence that can prove the psychological impact of violence on the woman can be misused and can be used against her, especially in custody cases, to say that she cannot look after her children. So it's something to be really cautious and mindful about. And of course, if you do take the decision of helping the woman, if you do take the decision of being a witness or giving an evidence, be prepared to wait, because the legal process, as we know, takes its own time. The case can go on for months or for years. It is time consuming, but just realizing that your support and your help and what it can do to the woman is something that perhaps should encourage you to come forward and help her.
So to wrap up, we thought it would be helpful to recommend certain best practices and not just to point out what's not working in the system. So we wanted to encourage the creation of self-help infrastructure in courts and police stations to address some of these issues, convene regular meetings with stakeholders to discuss cases, and have healthcare providers and nonprofits triage cases as first respondents and connect stakeholders to women. So one last point that we'd like to mention is that we believe that it's essential to make the process of filing for a protection order easy so women can do it on their own, as opposed to relying on these providers to do so. We hope this was a helpful experience, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Meghna and Bhumika. That was very, very insightful, and I think answered a lot of questions. We're getting a lot of comments from our audiences talking about how this is really a difficult place to negotiate, especially given our experiences in police stations with lawyers. And we'll discuss that a little bit more in detail when we come to the panel discussion. We have another lawyer on board. If you'd like to look at Shakti's work, you just please log on to shaktiwomen.org. They have we have a lot of a repository on information that you can use. White Swan Foundation and Shakti recently entered a collaboration where they have created a fantastic repository of information for mental health experts on how they can prepare and help survivors of domestic abuse with information. So please check that out. The link is going to be pasted in the comments section. Of course, you'll also find it on our homepage, given that we're talking about, we're focusing on domestic abuse this week. So thank you so much, Meghna and Bhumika. Moving on to our next panel, I think, several, both during Kamalaji's talk, during Shruti's very, very heart-wrenching sharing of her narrative and the work that she does thereof. I think and with Meghna's and Bhumika's presentation, it's fairly clear that the complexity around domestic abuse is immense, and this is not an easy situation for anyone to be in. And like Aarti mentioned in her presentation, it's not just women. It's often, what do you do if you are a survivor of any kind of abuse? What next? How do you make this decision? From the outside, and we've said this several times, it seems like a very black and white situation to say, why are you just not leaving? Why is this so difficult? And and we react with shock when we see, not only do we assume that this is a problem of of people of a certain kind of strata, we react with shock when we see confident women in situations of abuse, whether it is physical, emotional, or financial. So our panel now is going to, we'd really like to delve deep into this topic and say, what is the answer to why don't women just leave, or or in other cases, men or transgenders or anyone else? Why is it so difficult to leave? I'll start to introduce our panel. We have Kirti Jaikumar, who's a feminist researcher and lawyer. Kirti founded the Gender Security Project, which works at the intersection of gender, peace, justice, and security through research, reportage, and documentation. She's also coded an app called Sahas to support survivors of gender-based and sexual violence world over. Welcome, Kirti. Anuradha Kapoor, I think those of us who work in this space are very familiar with her. Anuradha founded Swayam, a feminist organization committed to advancing women's rights and ending gender inequality and violence against women. She's an activist, she's a trainer and consultant for women and human rights organizations, academic institutions, and UN agencies. Next is Dr. Aishwarya Pethe Kulkarni. She's a clinical psychologist, friend of White Swan Foundation. She currently has a private practice with adults, couples, and adolescents. Her work focuses on adult mental health, trauma, long-term health conditions, and relationship difficulties. She's previously worked with the NHS and voluntary sectors for 10 years across several adult and youth mental health settings. And of course, we've all heard from Shruti. It's very, for us, it's important that Shruti bring in both her fantastic work working in the space of gender-based violence and also from her own personal experience. I think Shruti is just going to make this conversation that much richer. So just to begin, and I think the context has been set. I don't need to do anything more, but so I'm just going to dive right in. I'll start with you, Anuradha, to say that, we've heard so much, and we've heard, the legal complexities, we've heard the personal story, but from your experience, and since you work on the ground, what do you see as the big barrier as to why women often stay for these long periods of time, and sometimes it's often decades and years, and if you could just give us an overview of what you see, at a macro level.
I think, there's no one big barrier. There are many, many barriers that women have to face. And I think Shruti brought up quite a few of them. And I think one of them is a mental issue, an issue of how your self is completely erased when you're facing violence, where you feel completely, like there is no self-confidence, there's no self-esteem. So there is the ability for you to take a decision also becomes completely minimized when you're facing violence on a day-to-day basis. And as Shruti pointed out, the violence is, it's not always a huge physical abuse, but it is a daily kind of wearing away of your sense of self, because you're constantly blamed for what is happening to you. And you start actually believing that you're responsible for this violence in a sense. So it's a very complicated mental situation that women are in, and they kind of don't have any faith in their ability to be able to deal with the situation on their own. That's at one level. And the other thing is also, the practicality of it. If a woman has to leave a situation, and I'd like to bring here, like, that domestic violence mostly we've been talking about so far has been marital violence, but it also happens in the parental home. And so you have young women who are, studying, who are in school, college, and throughout, they are facing this abuse directly from parents, right? So that's another level of abuse. Now, how do you leave? If you have to leave, you have to have a place to stay. Many women don't have that. They don't have, and the biggest thing I think is that there is a stigma attached to leaving. Now, if a woman leaves, she's blamed for what did she do wrong? It's never, what did the abuser do? It's always the woman who is being blamed. So there is a huge stigma attached. That's one. The other thing is that, the whole, especially the social support that you need is not there. So if your friends, relatives, everybody you talk to will say to you, put up with it a little bit. This is what, this is a family, these things happen. So you're not getting that support that you need. You need somebody to help you, move out, but you're not getting that support. And with families, if you're fighting with your own family, in the sense that if the family is the abuser, right? If your parents are the abuser, where do you go as a young woman who has no space, no financial ability to move out? And you're young, you're vulnerable. How do you do that? And if you are in a situation where you're married and you're being abused, again, do you have the ability to move out to a space, a shelter? And are you going to be able to financially support yourself and your children? So there are many, many issues. So there is, at one level, how society views you, how family, friends, neighbors, all of them. And it's always like, if it's domestic violence, let's not intervene. Let's not get involved. It's their personal matter. But, I keep saying that domestic violence is a crime. It's not a personal issue. If somebody is abusive who is not related to you, immediately people see it as violence. But why is it that that person is related to you? They get the right to do this, and everybody supports them or says it's okay, put up with it. I think this is a big, and these are the things that will prevent somebody from going out, because where is she going to get that support from? And another big issue that stops women from leaving is if they have children. Because there is this other thing of how will I support the children? How will I educate them? Where will we stay? All of these issues, financial and otherwise. But there's also one more thing, which is that how can I deprive the child of the father? The child needs both a mother and a father. And what we see is that this is a very, very, difficult thing for women to get out of. So that also becomes another reason why women can't leave. So the children bind the woman, her own emotional space, and the way she's undermined, and the lack of support around her, all of these combine to make it really, really difficult for her to leave. And the longer she is in that relationship, I find that more difficult it is for her to leave. And this is something that we've seen, that if you take that, if you're able to get the support in earlier stages, if that support is available to you and you can take that step, it's easier. But the longer you stay in it, the more difficult it becomes for you to come out of it. So it's a very complicated thing. And one last thing I'll say, because it's domestic violence, right? It is people you love or supposed to love, who are supposed to love you, who are supposed to be family, who you're supposed to trust the most, who are supposed to be this, what Kamlaji talked about, this great Indian family. All of this, it is that person who's so intimate and close to you who's abusing you. Look at the trust that is broken there. Look at the lack of ability to trust anybody else. Now thinking, I can't trust my father, I can't trust my mother, I can't trust my husband, I can't trust my brother. How will I trust somebody outside if I leave? So it's a huge trust deficit also that is created. So I think all of these things together combined make domestic violence such a difficult and complex issue. And that is really, it's very hard for women to break that chain. And, there is this peculiar love-hate also that plays out. And it's not always that there may be in some situations something where you feel, particularly with children, I've noticed that there is this ambivalent feeling towards the abuser. On the one hand, there is an anger, but on the other hand, this is also my father, or this is also my mother, this is also my, so it's that, or my husband. So it's that feeling of intimacy that prevents people from taking, a step outwards and speaking about the abuse.
Thank you, Anuradha. And I think it'll be good to come to you, Aishwarya, to kind of, just the points that Anuradha made both at the start of her answer and the end, that, that this becomes very complex from the mind, from the psychological perspective. The decision isn't simple. So, and it's not just purely a logistical question. So what really is happening, and what happens to the mind when we are at the receiving end of trauma?
So, as Anuradha rightly pointed out, it's a very complex process, leaving the abuser, and not an easy one. But what happens when we are subject to repeated trauma or ongoing trauma, or even if it's a single one-off incident? So a lot of the research that has been done with populations who have a diagnosis of chronic PTSD. So war veterans, refugees, survivors of child abuse, domestic violence, individuals who have been trafficked. And all of these studies show that there's significant cognitive impairment. So there is often, we find cognitive processes like memory, attention, planning, problem solving. These are all affected when we have experienced trauma. Now, repeated trauma or prolonged trauma, it primes us to divert our attention to threat perception, which is a stress response. And thereby it limits all our other cognitive processes. So there is a definite emotion cognition link there, And clinical studies have also supported this through functional neuroimaging studies. And it shows that the brain areas like the hippocampus, which is the memory center, the amygdala, which is the emotion center, and the prefrontal cortex, which has all our executive functions, the planning, organization, decision-making, all these get activated. So they are definitely impacted. Trauma memories are stored in fragments, just purely because they're so overwhelming to see as a whole. So they're often stored as fragments, which is a protective function. You know? And then there are, you might find yourself with intrusive thoughts, which are quite common. We try to push them away or distract ourselves. Delayed responses to trauma can show up as fatigue, depression, anxiety, flashbacks, you know, where it feels like you're reliving that trauma all over again. There's nightmares, there's sleep disorders, and in some cases, chronic pain or autoimmune diseases as well. There's been some link between these health conditions and trauma. And of course, behaviorally, we see avoidance, you know, anything that is even remotely a reminder of the trauma, people, events, situations, we tend to avoid in that context. Yeah.
And this is usually to do with, you know, long term, and, you know, in the short term, is there something that, you know, in the way that this affects how people perceive threat, you know, because that was what you know, so is there a difference between short term trauma and long term trauma?
So, of course, the traumatic event can have repercussions not just on mental health, but also it can show up in physical symptoms that we have. And it can impact how we view ourselves or others or the world we live in, you know, because we have that lens on. We're hypervigilant for a lot of our surroundings. So that's quite an immediate response that we see to trauma. Just one thing I want to point out here is that everyone who experiences difficult life events doesn't always go on to develop trauma or PTSD. And there are a lot of factors involved there, you know, so it would, trauma can impact, the factors would be, you know, the kind of support system you have or your own coping skills or resilience that you may have. And of course, what access to resources. You know, so these are some very important factors. So not everyone develops trauma or PTSD symptoms, but the ones who do, so there are physical symptoms which they're not commonly recognized, or you wouldn't attribute them to trauma straight away because they would show up as headaches, aches and pains, generally feeling anxious and on edge, you know, where your heart is racing all the time, or there's disturbed sleep, there's fatigue, there's a startle response, and the hypervigilance that I mentioned earlier. In terms of cognitive processes, I've already mentioned memory, attention, information processing generally, which is affected. And they can happen in the short term as well as the long term, because the emotional aspects take longer to heal. You know, the physical wounds might heal quicker, perhaps, but the emotional scars stay with you for a longer period of time. And of course, there's the behavioral aspect to it, where the avoidance of places or activities that were previously enjoyable, you know, and we tend to isolate ourselves, we tend to withdraw, and not necessarily be by choice, because somebody who's been through that trauma, been through abuse, has already been isolated to an extent, you know, where you're cut off from your support network. So that continues. There's social withdrawal as part of this as well. And emotionally, this shows up as fear. There's a very real fear of the abuser, perhaps, or how is it going to be when I go out into the world, you know, and I'm faced with reality. There's detachment. There's a sense of disconnectedness that we feel from what's happening around us. And sometimes in extreme cases, that can lead to dissociation, where it feels you're not here. There's anger and irritability. So it may not be always rage outbursts, but it might show up as irritability on a day-to-day basis. And of course, there'll be anxiety attacks, there'll be panic attacks, there's guilt. There's a lot of self-blame and shame attached to trauma that we experience. So, and there's no right or wrong way to feel after a traumatic event, you know. Each person's different, each individual will experience it differently. There'll be maybe some people shut down or feel numb, and then tend to withdraw. Some people engage in substance use as a coping mechanism. That's a very common one we see. There's a close link between trauma and substance use as a coping mechanism. So yeah, this is where the cognitive brain shuts down and the emotional brain takes over.
Thank you, Aishwarya. Shruti, I'd like to come to you. You know, there was a point that Aishwarya made about, how the physical wounds sort of heal, but the emotional wounds stay longer. And I'd like to come to you later as well, Anuradha, to look at what you see on the field. But I think just a little bit, and I don't think that's recognized enough, that once you exit the unsafe space, it is over. And you talked about it in your narrative as well. But both from the work that you do and and your own experience, could you tell us a little bit about how this works? As in, why is it it is difficult to detach from the emotional experience? But could you explain this for our audience?
I think one important thing that people tend to miss about abuse is the cyclical nature of it. And it's not just one cycle, it is concentric cycles and intermingling cycles. It's all a big mess, Until you understand that, you have missed the most important part of abuse. So whenever there is a question like, why did your mother wait 30 years to get out? Or what took you so long? You're educated, you know better. Whatever the form the question may take, what they don't understand is, and I want to build on the question of trust, which is so absolutely true. If your trust has been broken by a parent, your sibling, or an intimate partner, you immediately are doubting your judgment. So even if I am standing at the edge of having gathered courage to escape the situation, my question is, whom do I trust? Who's going to be the next person with whom I'm going to share this story, where I am the victim, where my dignity has been lost, I've been made to feel like I do not deserve any respect. It is the most vulnerable state I've been in. Whom do I share with? And one aspect of cyclical nature, which is again not, I guess, spoken about enough, is how the society's reaction to you actually coming out is in fact an extension of abuse. Because here you are being abused by a parent figure or an intimate partner. You go out, you seek help, because that's what you're supposed to do, right? The onus is on you to go out and seek help. But when you seek help, your dignity is questioned again. You are asked again, why were you there? Why did you let it go on for so long? Or worse is when they refuse to acknowledge it, when they do not care what you say, when they say, oh, maybe he was tired, maybe he has suffered a loss in his business, maybe he didn't like the sabzi you made. The social reaction, the social apathy, the social cruelty is absolutely an extension of the abuse a victim or a survivor faces. To see it as two separate things is, at the intersection of it, is where a question like, why didn't you leave, stands. This delineation of social responsibility from what women in majority face in the form of abuse is what is problematic today. And that is why it is still looked at as a private issue and not a crime. It is a crime. It is a crime against my human right, my dignity, my safety, and my right to life as I want to live. So this cyclical nature of it has to be understood very strongly before all the onus of escaping, all the onus of figuring out, and all the onus of seeking justice is placed on the survivor herself. Another thing that trust and the cyclical nature of it that I would like to point out is, if a survivor has reached a point where she wants to escape, there is a good chance that she is going to rely on a person who is closest to her. That could be a good friend, but sometimes it is also a relative. Abuse also moves in cycles, and that has happened in my family also. So I could be thinking that I'm going to escape tomorrow and I'm going to go to my brother's house. But my brother was also raised in the same abusive household. There is a good chance that he has picked up those abusive patterns and is going to repeat it. And there is a good chance that that repetition is going to affect me again. So it's not just about the cyclical nature of me seeking abusive partners, maybe later in life, because I do not have a better judgment. I feel that's what is the baseline of treatment of a partner. But it is also that the people we trust also, who were also raised in a similar environment, may possibly repeat that behavior. So we have to understand the intersection of gender here is extremely strong, because a lot of the reasons why women are staying is also connected to their gender, their expectations of motherhood, the expectations of keeping the secrets of the family. But it is also that sometimes the second round of abuse again victimizes them and again silences them. So till we understand that factor, that as you said, the moment you extricate yourself, the abuse ends, that is absolutely untrue. The abuse, the effects of it, there is no expiry date to it. Like I stated my narrative and I had to take a break because it still affects me. It still bothers me. It still makes me think back to things which I don't want to think about, because I don't want those memories to sully my experiences today. So there is no deadline to how abuse affects you. There is no gradation to abuse. There is no template to what abuse can do to you. So till these cyclical aspects of abuse, these intergenerational aspects of abuse are understood, we do not do justice to how we support survivors.
Thank you, Shruti. And taking on from that, Kirti, I'd like to come to you to talk about, no one likes to go to a police station, even to report a robbery, but it must be that much more difficult. And of course, Meghna and Bhumika talked about the systemic difficulties in dealing with this. But just what Shruti was mentioning, that you have to go through this process all over again. Could you tell us about perhaps to start with the barriers, and I think we've heard some of that, but what are the solutions? What can women keep in mind when they're doing this, perhaps? Is there a way around this? Should it be so difficult?
Thank you so much for the question. And I'd just like to take a minute to thank everyone who spoke, especially Shruti for sharing her story. So the police is fundamentally representative of society, right? It comprises people who were raised and conditioned by society, and they carry the same values that society has normalized for them, which is values of misogyny, of patriarchy, of heteronormative thinking. And all of this, they wield with quote unquote unfettered power, because they are in a position to actually carry that power forward and use it as they please. Now, think about that on the one hand, and then think about everything that a survivor is processing, fresh off the bat after facing abuse. Really just thinking about whether that step is something she should take in that situation. What are all the consequences she has to bear, hidden as well as apparent, as well as possibly apparent in certain ways. Now, putting those two together automatically gives you a recipe for more re-traumatization. And the police isn't essentially kind, right? You bring a survivor before them, the police starts its duty with moral policing. You have questions thrown at the survivor, which make the survivor sort of feel that she invited all of it. Gaslighting a survivor begins right at that point. And then you think about every step in the process that follows. The investigation, the way in which questions are asked, the kind of evidence that is sought, and the ways in which that evidence is asked for, or perhaps demanded, or perhaps expected. And if it's absent, or if the survivor is not able to think about what happened in ways that the police wants them to recount it, they're automatically subject to more rude comments, to say it politely. So if every step of the process is like that, turning to the police becomes more than just an act of courage. It becomes a huge leap of faith. It becomes mustering every last dreg of the trust that you couldn't find in the family around you, in the people that violenced you, and then to put it into a system that has failed people several times over. Now, I want to tell you that there is a workaround that is foolproof and that has succeeded, but I don't have a means to tell you that without sounding like a liar. Fundamentally, when you look at the police as an institution, the poverty of empathy there really stands tall. Perhaps some members in the upper echelons evince that empathy, they bring that to their job, they're dedicated in showing and presenting that, but it's not always the case. Now, Meghna brought up a really powerful point, which is, how do you know where to go? You think about the police in your mind, but then from the police, you're diverted to this, to that, to the other place, and you don't even know if they are going to listen to you in the way that you want to be heard. And then you go through the process at every iteration. So you see, the structure itself lacks empathy. It is decidedly pushing the survivor from place to place instead of receiving the survivor and cutting all of the administrative paraphernalia in between. And then the actors in that system are then working in ways that are not empathetic either. So I have two things that I know has worked on ground, which again speaks to something that came up earlier, which is to dispel the siloization of work, to work cohesively as an ecosystem, to create the space that a survivor can find and access justice in, which means if you have an NGO, if you have a lawyer, if you have a therapist who can work together to stand up with the survivor, not for with, because the agency of the survivor cannot be taken away at any time, with the survivor through the process, then you actually have more currency for the survivor to actually raise her voice and ask for what she deserves in the name of justice. The second thing is vigilance and bystander intervention at every step. We often outrage and express umbrage only after the survivor has died, and the news blows it out of proportion for good reason, but blows it out of proportion in the way it reports sensationally. We don't need to wait to that point. We don't need to wait until that tipping point is reached, because we are complicit by inaction in allowing that tipping point to arrive in the first place. So vigilance at every stage, stepping up, showing up, using your privilege and your social capital in ways that can support a survivor who obviously has lost that privilege and that social capital because of the violence she's faced, in ways that can help her access systems and structures that are not responsive to her. That can maybe work towards creating maybe some form of a beneficial situation for the survivor. I don't think we're there yet. It would be perhaps too much of a sugar coating, if you will, to say that this is the solution. We are still trying to get there, and we need to work as much as we can, all hands on deck, to be able to get there.
Thank you, Kirti. Anuradha, I'd like to come to you with two questions. One is, of course, follow up on what Kirti was saying, that often working in cohesion, and that if we had mental health experts and we had the NGOs, and I think we get this question all the time, being in the space of mental health, who do we approach? What is your first port? And often the police is not the first port. So what is really the best answer to this? And we are going to put out resources and helplines. But what should one expect when you do reach out to an NGO? Are there things that you can look out for yourself to say that if you check these boxes, then you're perhaps a reliable NGO?
Well, I think I totally agree with Kirti that you have to work in cohesion. And if you look at Swayam, the whole idea of setting up an organization was to bring all the services together for the woman, because it was, you're running pillar to post for different services, whether it's legal services, whether it's mental health, whether it is financial. I mean, all of these services needed to be brought together so that the survivor is supported at every step, right? And that's the idea, I think. And bringing in mental health is a very, very important issue, I think. And this is something that is missed out. But unless you have mental health woven into your work and understand the impact of violence on women's mental health, I think then you're missing out a big area. So this is one thing I think that really needs to be brought in. And from my own experience, I think one more layer added onto it is bringing women who are survivors together, because that really supports them, and they see that, we talked about the fact that this is something that is acceptable in society, but most people think it's happening to me, there's something wrong with me, but they're not connecting it to the structural issues, that this is actually a structural problem problem is not with me, it's with the way society is structured, and that there are many women who are dealing with it like me, and they have also been able to move ahead. So they see positive role models also, that I maybe at this point in time, I don't feel that I can take action, I can do anything. But when I see women who have been through that, I get supported because I see that this is also possible. So I think that is one more area of bringing women together. And, you know, I think responding to needs of women as an organization, as an NGO, we've actually responded to what has been asked of us from women. For example, it was, you know, Aishwarya also talked about feelings, you know, what happens? Women get very angry. Why is it happening to me? Why am I having to deal with this? And how do you deal with that anger? Then there is a child in the picture. Then there is an issue about feeling sometimes very angry with the child or feeling overprotective with the child. So there are issues between mother and child. So you have to deal with those. And all of these, like if you can have, you know, programs which we have in our organization to bring the mother and child together, to understand each other, to empathize with each other, to see how they can relate, where the issues are coming. I think we need to actually try and respond to the needs as we go along, because it is so complicated, the whole issue. So I think that's one big area of the support is required. So now, like, for example, if you have a lawyer, you have a mental health professional, you have the organization also telling you, you know, often what happens with the legal system is that I go to a lawyer, the lawyer does everything for me, I have no idea what's happening. But the role of the NGO is actually to explain to you that if you take these different options, what does it do? And, you know, the police, in my own experience, has been the last person that women want to go to, particularly in case of domestic violence, because you don't want to go to put your idea is not to put the people who you so-called love, who are so-called intimate, your parents, your, you know, your father or your, intimate partner, you don't want them behind bars. Generally speaking, there's no woman comes in and tells us, you know what, I want to send him to jail. Does not happen. It's very rare that a woman will come with that. Their whole issue is, can this be resolved? I want the violence to stop. I want to live a life that is a life of, you know, which is free from violence and from fear. And I want a life of dignity. Can you do that? So, you know, the police comes much later when there's like, and oftentimes the cases that the police file, women don't even know what is being filed. You know, they go there to say, this is what's happening to me. Sometimes when the women want a case to be filed, it's not filed. But when they don't want a case to be filed, without telling them what the repercussions of this will be, the case is filed, right? So the NGO's job or role is to really explain to her, look, these are your options. Now, if you do this, this is what will happen. If you take this option, this is what will happen. And then support her and aid her to come to a decision, not take decisions for her, because, you know, as you said, it's her life and she will decide whether this is what she needs to do or she doesn't need to do. But our role is to constantly be there to say, it's your life. Whatever decision you take, we will be with you. We will support you. And I think that's how we need to build that confidence. So a lot of work that we need to do with women is also to build confidence. What are the ways in which we can do that? And bringing them together and constantly telling them that you can do it. And I'm not taking a decision for you because you can do it. It may take time, and that's fine. You take your time. And I think that is where we really need to focus on, is to build the strength. And I'll tell you one thing, I have 25 years, we've worked with thousands of women. The kind of resilience that women have is absolutely stunning. I mean, I learn every day. I look at some of the cases that come to you, they're like, you know, fact is stranger than fiction. That's the kind of cases we get. And when women turn around and they can actually go move, it's a difficult process. It's not something that happens overnight, or I'm not saying that this is just it's a very difficult process, but they do it. And that's where I think, you know, we need to focus. And the other thing I would say is also to be with them. It's not like you go once and you give some advice and you give some support and that's over. You need a long-term engagement with women, especially when domestic violence is concerned. So I think that is also something that we need to see, that you need to give them support over a period of time so that they are able to get back the strength and the ability to be able to take their own decisions, control their own lives, and then they'll fly. I think.
Thank you for that, Anuradha. Yeah, so we're a little short on time, but I do have, we're getting questions on the differentiation between physical and emotional abuse, and I imagine that will also include financial. So I'll come to you, Aishwarya, very quickly to talk about, how often do people manage to identify emotional abuse? And we've talked about the cyclical nature, and perhaps that often abusers are fairly manipulative. So is it difficult to identify? And then perhaps we'll come to our other panelists to say that, how does the system then deal with emotional abuse when there isn't a physical angle to it? Yeah, Aishwarya.
So physical abuse, like I mentioned earlier, the scars might be visible. So it's, when it's seen, people can actually, express their concern for it. But the emotional scars, which are invisible, are often difficult to recognize. So women themselves don't recognize that they are in an abusive relationship. And very often abusers are known to be manipulative, and emotional manipulation is, it's a web. The manipulators can be often charming initially, very perceptive. They have an uncanny ability to see when you are at your wit's end, and then, perhaps they pull back and become reasonable again. So it's cyclical again. So you kind of keep thinking, okay, maybe it'll be different next time, and there's hope. What is frustrating is that they turn things around in a way that you may ultimately give them, what they want, but exhaust yourself in that process, which is where you lose your sense of self. Your needs are second, or perhaps not in the picture at all. And years later, when we connect the dots, the manipulation's crystal clear. But while we are going through it, most of us are not cynical. We are not wired to look out for trickery. So it's difficult to spot these signs. So, paying attention, especially in the initial stages of a relationship, being aware of the red flags, or pausing to think things through, paying attention to what you feel in that particular equation are very important markers. So sometimes early on, the manipulation may be something along the lines of, I had a rough childhood, so sometimes I say and do things which I don't mean, but I love you. Or it can be financial, where you take on more a larger chunk of the financial responsibility. So there are other red flags which accompany these. They're not always there all the time, or not. One person may not have all of them, but these are just some to look out for. So things like jealousy, or there's controlling behavior, which initially when you're in a new relationship, that might come across as endearing, that, oh, he or she is checking up on me, or is concerned where I'm going, whether I'm coming back on time. But at what point does it become, uncomfortable? There's rage outbursts, and often how they treat other people. So you might go to, say, a restaurant, and how they behave with service staff. That's a good indicator to watch out for. There's lack of empathy, lack of remorse or guilt about said or done, which has really hurt physically, emotionally. And a sense of entitlement, that I need to be looked after, my needs come first, and everything else is secondary. Infidelity, that's a common one. That's a big red flag we see. There's a lot of lying and unpredictability, where you always feel you're walking on eggshells. You never know which way the mood is going to swing. And of course, there's intimidation and threats. And this is often accompanied by physical sexual violence. Not always, but it can be. So, it's all about power and control. So these are, it's important to watch out how we feel in a given situation.
Thanks, Aishwarya. Keith, come to you and say, how does the system respond to emotional abuse? Physical is not very good in itself, but
Sure. So whether it's the DV Act that you're looking at or Section 498A of the IPC that you're looking at, both sets of provisions actually include mental harm within their ambit, right? There's a misconception that emotional abuse or mental harm cannot be prosecuted under 498A or does not constitute domestic violence, but both of these are included within the provision. In fact, 498A is defined as widely as possible to include as many possible variations in which cruelty manifests within its scope. And even if you look at matrimonial legislation, the personal laws in the country, be that the Hindu Marriage Act, Special Marriage Act, or the Christian Marriage Act as well, you will find that there is a provision on which cruelty is a basis for divorce. And what that cruelty is, it speaks to the impact on an individual in terms of a mental, affecting their mental well-being, so to speak. So broadly, this is what the law says. Now, in action, of course, we all know that there is a big disconnect between the two. There are instances where cases of emotional abuse, of mental cruelty have been downplayed by the police or even by lawyers who just dismiss it as आपस का मामला है, it's a conversation between husband and wife, घर का मामला है, छोड़ दो, ये सब ठीक हो जाएगा, or just go back and do this for him or do that for so and so, it will settle. Now you have both, right? So the question is then, again, going back to how we can get the system to respond to the provision in a way that can make it work for a survivor. So whether that calls for relying on a professional, like for instance, Dr. Aishwarya was so clear in explaining all the impacts that one can't tangibly see, but actually manifest in one's bodily behavior, conduct, as well as well-being. So if we had that as a cohesive system, presenting the case of a survivor, presenting it before the law enforcement officials, that's a watertight case there for you. It's hard to throw something out when it's so clearly grounded on fact. And I know I keep going back to the fact that we can't siloize, and I know I'm making it sound like an ideal solution, but there really is no workaround because we're dealing with a systemic problem, and we need to create a counter system that brings together every actor that can build that case strong.
Thanks, Kirti. And Anuradha, just to talk about where does emotional abuse sort of fall into, or financial for that matter, you know, the more difficult to put your finger on kind of abuse. How does it play out? Do women ever report it? Do they come into, do they talk about it?
Absolutely. I mean, I think that this is something that women will come and say that, and it's also something I think Aishwarya touched upon, that it's, women will say, Didi, थप्पड़ मारा तो उसका दर्द चला जाता है, जो बोला ना, उसका दर्द नहीं जाता. So I think that that is something that women completely understand. And it is something that is, and this whole business of self-worth going down comes from this mental abuse. It's not always physical abuse. And we've seen many ways in which mental abuse has been used. I mean, things like making you eat out of a plate and in which you have spit, okay? You spit on the plate, ask you to eat, that's abuse. I mean, this kind of abuse, the kind of degradation that a woman will feel, it's something that they can share easily. Oftentimes, they'll come and they will talk to you about this and then say, isn't it abuse? Or is it abuse? They will say that, but they can articulate it. It is possible for them to say, and we have had many cases where there has been no physical abuse. It has been very much mental abuse, and women will come and they will ask for support for it, because I mean, it's actually more difficult to deal with that than to deal with the physicality of the abuse. I think for women, that is something that is constantly talked about. So this issue, and as Kirti also pointed out, that our laws do talk about mental impact on mental health. However, because patriarchal thinking does not allow for this to be seen as abuse. So when the person who's sitting behind that desk, who's going to be able to support you, which whether it is the police or it is the judge, or it is, you know, the protection officer who's supposed to support you, if they only hear about what they call, oh, बातचीत में उसको गाली दी है, या, you know, कुछ बोला ही है, they don't take it seriously. And I think that's what needs to change. And, you know, it all comes back to this whole business of power, control, and how you view women. I think at the end of the day, if we want to change anything, we have to change this patriarchal understanding, which Kamlaji talked about right at the beginning, where you have to respect everybody, men, women, transgenders, all. And unless you do that, this is not going to change. It's a long drawn out thing, because I've seen, you know, we've done gender training, we've done sensitization training, this, that. Patriarchal thinking at this age, when they come to those positions, it's not going to change. We had a case, I mean, just today we were talking about a case where a woman has gone to the police station. She's been sitting there the whole day. Police is refusing to take her back to her marital home, even though that house is in her husband and her name. They're refusing to take her back because she's done a 498A case, and there's nothing in law that says that she cannot go back. But they are saying, oh, you'll do a case against your husband. You're a bad woman. You've done this. How are we going to take you back? So this is this is the perception from which they are speaking. And to change that, we have a very, I mean, what Kirti is talking about is when it's happening, what do we do? But to prevent it, I think we really have to start from scratch. From when children are born, you have to treat them equally and teach them to respect everybody equally. And until that change happens, I don't see that there's going to be much of a difference, because all of these people in positions of power are patriarchal in their thinking. And it could be a woman also who's sitting as a judge who will be as patriarchal as you can get. So I think that that's the problem that we're dealing with. And patriarchal thinking does not allow for a woman who's being talked to like this. It's normal. That's how she's supposed to be spoken to, right? So I think that's a big issue. But for women themselves, I think they definitely understand what is happening is abuse. But, you know, not getting support from the outside world to say, yes, it is. They are kind of nervous about, is it or not? But they can feel it and they will articulate it.
Thank you. Thank you. I think there's so much more to talk about, just, you know, simply on the decision to leave, and just those the big question that society tends to ask women: why don't you just walk out? But we're short on time, and we have to go into the next session of the symposium. Just a quick reminder: I know we're constantly talking about women, but we do want to, you know, tell our audience that, you know, a lot of this is as applicable to to different sexualities, depending on, you know, your vulnerability. So do take everything that we're saying. We're using the word woman as a placeholder, but it applies to anyone who is vulnerable to abuse. I'll hand over to my colleague Aarti, who will be talking to Aishwarya about mental health aspects. Thank you so much, Anuradha, Shruti, and Kirti.
Thanks, Pavitra. Hello, Aishwarya. To go forward, just to tell everyone how the next few sessions, this next section is going to be, we're talking about how survivors can care for their mental health. And this is irrespective of whether they have left the relationship or not. Because if you've seen in the previous panel discussion, it's not just the decision you make that easily. So keeping that in mind, I'm going to discuss with Dr. Aishwarya about the different aspects that we can take into consideration, some things about how a person can pick up the pieces and move forward and take the journey of healing forward. To start with, my first question to you would be, what's the first step? Like, they've recognized the violence, assuming that they've left the relationship, what then? Because there is, like you mentioned in the previous panel, that there's so many short-term and long-term implications to being subject to violence. It's really difficult for a person to come to terms with the fact that they've been abused, and also to have to agree that so much has happened to them and this is possibly going to affect them at different paths. So what is it that you as a psychologist could suggest to people?
Yeah. So just one thing to bear in mind, the conversation today around mental health is going to be fairly generic, because with, as Shruti was saying earlier, that each person who experiences trauma or abuse experiences it in different ways. So there needs to be a deep understanding of context individually, for each individual. So the first step, like you said, is to recognize that abuse is happening to you and acknowledge it, And we often come across narratives. I was having a conversation that day, and I heard someone say to them, "Itna sehte hai, ek aur sahi." So it's okay. It's a marriage, or it's just a slap. So it's important to recognize these narratives and say, no, this is not okay. So that's the first step, I would say. The second step, I would say, is try and speak to someone. Not necessarily if you don't feel able or ready or safe enough to ask for help, but just speaking to someone to get validation of what you've been through. I think that's very important. Following that, I would say establish safety for yourself. And it is not possible to start feeling empowered right away. It is, we need to be in a safe space to be able to do that, where at least your basic needs are taken care of. When I say that, I think of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where your basic needs, your food, shelter, money, where are you going to stay? Where are you going to sleep? Are you going to be out on the roads? So these kind of things need to be planned. And always best to plan before taking any action. So recovery is usually a long process. It's complicated, and like Shruti was saying, it's not complete. The abuse doesn't stop when you leave the relationship. It continues. Then you start with your own self-critical talk, where you're thinking about your self-worth, your self-esteem. You're blaming yourself or wondering, did I do something wrong? Was it not enough? Or could it have been different? So, and there's a lot of shame and stigma attached to it. So it's important to keep that in mind and treating yourself gently. Be patient. It will happen. It takes time. This abuse, if it's happened over 30 years, it's not going to resolve in 2 months. So even therapy is highly crucial, to avoid PTSD or to even work with PTSD symptoms if they develop. Making meaning of the entire incident or incidents that have happened to you, or what might have been taken from you, the loss. There's also a loss there. And if you have access to a phone or the internet, there are helplines that one can access for professional help. There's teleservices, there's chat therapy. There are a lot of practitioners now offering services online. So these are just some of the immediate steps that one can take to start recovering. It's never going to be not never, but it's going to be very difficult to do it all on your own. So it's best to do it with someone, someone who can bear witness to the trauma that you've experienced.
Right. Especially with the fact that you said that it's important to take therapy as the journey that you use to, work with people.
Yeah.
Considering how mental health is so rarely spoken about, especially in the space of domestic violence as well, how does somebody take that first step to even approach therapy? Because we know that even otherwise, this is aside from society's views and how a person who's been abused, therapy is highly stigmatized on its own. So to be seen as someone who's going for therapy, in addition to also being seen as someone who's a survivor of violence, what are the complexities in this such sort of situation for a survivor themselves to deal with, or just in general, like how do you communicate this information to someone on how therapy is important?
Sorry, can you repeat that last?
I meant how
therapy is important.
Yes, especially for someone who's a survivor of violence.
Okay, so I think the one thing to remember is, again, therapy or mental health by itself will I don't think will be enough. And as a lot of the speakers were saying, we need multi-agency, maybe multidisciplinary, survivor groups, along with therapy. So that's one important thing to remember. And it is, it's important. There are people who will be toying with the idea of, do I stay or do I go? So, when in a situation like that, of course, while offering all the other support and the practical strategies that we have, therapy can be quite useful in helping people make that decision, and just even helping them think through what would be the implications of them staying, what they could do while they decide to stay on, if they choose to stay on, that is, and if they decide to leave, what are they going to be faced with? So it's almost, even they may not be ready to resolve the trauma they've been through, but helping them think through what to expect, even, because sometimes they may not be. And often I get people come to me and they say, well, I don't know what to expect. I was just sent for a chat. And that's okay. That first point of contact is okay, because you take it from there. Then you assess if they're ready to engage, if there's, if they feel safe enough to engage, actually. Does that answer your question?
What are some of the healthy coping strategies that you could suggest for a person who has left a relationship, or because like you mentioned, it is a loss on its own as well, right? Like the end of a relationship. So and there has been a lot of research about how this can increase in other issues like substance related issues for women or other people who've been in situations. Is there, and understandably, the considering all the other situations around the person, there could be a chance that they may slip into any sort of difficulty and be unable to cope, considering how abuse also essentially destroys a person's sense of self as well. So what are some of those kind of issues that you could highlight upon?
So some of the healthy coping strategies, and this is, it's always a tricky one, because if you're still in that relationship, how can we even begin to care for ourselves when our sense of safety is threatened? So I think the one thing I usually say is, in therapy, we start working with problem solving, empowering the individual, identifying resources, and which people can do for themselves. Identify your own resources or your own support network, engage with those social networks that you might have, been cut off from. In overall, if it's safe, then do maintain these social connections, because they will help keep you grounded, will help with the validation. Secondly, I think it's the safety plan that I mentioned. I think whether it's locking yourself in a room while you phone a friend, or whether you need to just leave, up sticks and leave, whatever it may be, but plan, I would say, have a realistic plan, because the main focus here is keeping yourself safe and minimizing harm where possible. Third, which we often talk about, is self-care. Now, how do we care for our mental health when we are experiencing ongoing trauma? Or self-care in an abusive context can, it might seem pointless or scary, selfish even to some people, especially if there are children involved, or if you have others to care for in that relationship. Or you could just be made to feel that you're not worthy of it. So I think bringing your attention back to self-care, and something as basic as, and I say basic, but I know it may not be for a lot of people, is by making small gradual changes, for your basic needs. Do you get enough sleep, enough rest? Do you eat well? Are you getting some, some sort of a break, and start by doing this maybe one a day. If it feels too much to do it all, maybe just try and tackle that. I would say. Then there are other things that people can try. If some people find solace in writing, so people can do that. There's art people turn to, anything creative, because that's an outlet for us. And of course, reading. Different people will have, they engage in physical activities or staying grounded, doing some grounding exercises like your breathing, muscle relaxation, perhaps watching a program that you like, or engaging in meaningful activity that means something to you, something for yourself, I think.
And when you spoke about the sense of self and all of that, and this is something Anuradha also mentioned in the previous panel, that uh, some in the case of domestic abuse, it's someone you trust, it's somebody you had some sort of placed some sort of trust in, and they are the ones who have gone and broken that trust, and they have been the perpetrator of abuse. It does shatter the sense of trust. People, and of course, there's a lot of difficulty going forward and continuing to be intimate with someone or building that relationship with someone. um, how does the survivor rebuild all of this? How does the survivor move on and go ahead and look at building more healthy relationships in the future?
So learning to trust again is a big thing when it comes to relationships. And I would say the first step would be to acknowledge the loss that you have had, maybe looking at or learning from that experience, which we all, usually we are caught in a cycle of self-blame and, self-flagellation. So I think once we have processed that, once we have come to terms with it, made our peace, it's, no, you're not to blame, no, you're not at fault, that's when you can start looking at new relationships and going slow, I would say, looking out for red flags, or, engaging with, say, either a professional or a close trusted family member or a friend when you're starting new relationships, just as a comfort zone, a safety zone for you to discuss things if you're in doubt or if you're feeling unsure. And invariably you will come up with things which um, sort of set you back, so you might have a lot of self-esteem issues. And I would say alongside therapy, it's a good way to move forward. So not, not isolating yourself, trying to engage, keep engaging. Whatever little you can do is fine. Even if it's 15 minutes a day, half an hour a day, that's absolutely fine. And perhaps, volunteering, because that's a good way to meet people. Again, doing something that's meaningful. And it's a fairly neutral ground. You're not engaging with anybody at a deep, intimate level. You can, do your bit and come out again. So dipping in and out, regulating yourself while you're doing things, watching out for physical sensations, making sure you're not getting triggered by certain smells or sounds and things like that. So all these are important aspects which, help you. And of course, long-term therapy does help you with rebuilding that sense of trust and your sense of self after having been through such a traumatic experience.
Absolutely. My final question to you is, again, a lot of things, actually, something that should be mentioned as well, that society's reaction of you coming out is almost an extension of the abuse. And it is difficult for a survivor to come out there and go back into the world. Very often, there are people who hear this one statement from people saying that I knew it all along, or that you should have figured it out before. So, how does a survivor deal with this hindsight bias? Because they start doubting themselves, saying that, I say wasted all of my years being with the abuser, or say there's a child involved, my child had to go through this because I did not recognize. What happens then, and how do they really navigate this?
Yeah. So I think it is the most unhelpful thing to say or even think, because there's no predictive test that you could do. There's no saying, okay, your partner's going to turn abusive in X amount of time. So it's important to remember that this is absolutely victim blaming. It encourages the narrative that the victim is responsible for the violence. And again, as Kamlaji also mentioned, it's not just a women's issue. That some good men help out with, these are men's issues equally. And the moment we say it's women's issues, men might tend to tune out. So I think it's important to remember to engage all narratives, And as for hindsight, it's always 2020, isn't it? We become fortune tellers after the incident. So, and we always believe in that rescue fantasy that, okay, my love will transform the other person and there's hope of redemption. And but it's very confusing. It's not as if the abuser is cruel 24/7. They might have a very charming side to it. So it's very confusing. So the good moments will keep you in the game, and the bad moments is when we question ourselves. So I think just knowing that you are not to blame, be kind to yourself, be patient with yourself. I think these are key in remembering that there was no way you could have seen this coming.
Right, that's a really wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much, Dr. Aishwarya. I hope to everyone,
Thank you.
really helpful ways to realize that, being kind to yourself is going to take you a long way in healing. My colleague Ranjita now is going to take over and talk about the bystanders.
Thank you so much, Aarti. So far, I think all the panelists have done such a wonderful job kind of trying to help us look at the complexities around domestic abuse. And now for the last section, we're going to be moving into what can we as bystanders do? Who is a bystander, and can a bystander actually support someone who's experiencing domestic abuse? So on this panel with me, I have Anika Verma from Breakthrough. Anika leads digital campaigns at Breakthrough India and works at the intersections of violence against women and digital rights using creative new means to challenge the status quo on gender, sexuality, technology, and culture. For many of us, of course, we'd be familiar with Breakthrough with their Bell Bajao campaign, which was possibly one of the first campaigns, perhaps a couple of decades ago, to actually actively speak about bystander intervention. We also have with us Madhumita Venkatraman, the founder of Diversity Dialogues. Madhumita wears many hats. She is the founder of Diversity Dialogues. She's an HR professional, and now she's also a counselor. So Madhumita is in fact one of the authors of the book, Domestic Violence and the Indian Workplace. That's up on our portal right now. You could take a look at it. That talks about workplaces and what they can do to combat domestic violence. Madhumita has a lot of experience working with multiple diversity groups, including groups on domestic violence, and she's led diversity and inclusion in many large organizations. Thank you so much, Anika and Madhumita, for joining me today.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting us.
Yes. So maybe let's begin with the most essential question before we talk about what bystanders can do, which is to say, all this while we've been talking about how domestic violence is often something that happens within the home. Who then is a bystander in the context of domestic violence? Anika, would you like to take this?
Especially in the case of domestic violence happening in the homes, the first person or people who are actually the part of a family are the first bystanders. They could be children, they could be elderly people in the family, anybody you live with. So those are your first immediate people, immediate witnesses, and many times pets also. I'm going to, of course, talk about that as well. So the people who are living with you, and then there are people who live around your house. Now here, something which was very important that Anuradha earlier broke down was that we need to look at domestic violence from outside of the marital home space, where it's not just about a couple or a couple living with a joint family, but also some girl, young women living with their parents and being in those domestic spaces, irrespective of what your relationship with the family or the people you live with, you cohabit with are. So again, we need to sort of broaden the understanding of what domestic spaces are and what family spaces look like, and they go beyond the marriage space. So the of course, when you have people either living with you or living next to you, they become your first bystander, like physical bystanders in that case, who get to witness um, if there are forms of abuse that are happening to a woman. Then we've also seen when so we sort of take it a little ahead, and when we look at who the next bystander could be, that could be a person who's a relative, a friend, somebody who could be a neighbor, somebody, even your colleagues, your co-workers. If you go to your workplace, they become those bystanders who know what is either happening to you, uh, uh, or they may or may not say anything. I mean, that's the next step, but they become like your support sort of group and witness of what is happening to you in your life. Like I said, in many cases, there are a lot of when it happens in spaces where there are pets in the house, that also gets to that also actually adds to the dynamic. So, and also we need to make a distinction between what like an active bystander is and a passive bystander is. A passive bystander is just a spectator who's just looking at what is happening and may or may not intervene. But an active bystander is somebody who intervenes, who tries to reason with the perpetrator or just tries to diffuse that situation wherever that could be. But all of these situations sort of exist. Everybody's case is different. Everybody's life is different. Even in a public space, you have people who are strangers. Even in the online space, if you share something, you have people still talking to you, so they become the bystanders in that particular space. So basically, bystander is anybody who's um, living around you or has access to you, virtually or physically. So just to make sort of make that distinction about a bystander.
And also, I think let's talk a little bit about the Bell Bajao campaign. I think, as far as I remember, it was one of the first campaigns, in public to really talk about the role of the bystander and to actually say, hey, there's something concrete that you can do to diffuse a situation. Can you tell us a little more about the campaign itself and why you thought that there was a need to actually bring the bystander into this conversation, which often focuses around perhaps the survivor alone?
The journey actually started with the song Man Ke Manjeere, which sort of was the starting point for Breakthrough, when there were just a few, like a small group of people who worked on it, because there was a woman who had faced domestic violence, Shameen Patan, who's now, who became pretty famous after a very famous case that she actually sort of fought during that time. And that sort of inspired an idea that we're still looking at domestic violence as somebody's personal matter, while it's a public matter, while it's a crime. That all of that understanding was still kind of being slowly built, but there was not really any conversation. So coming from that space, creating a media movement which challenges the culture of violence, which looks at domestic violence from the lens of like from a crime perspective, and not just as a domestic issue, is where the whole journey started. So from 99 to 2000 and so on, the people, the Malika Dutt, who's just started the movement, the album, they started going and doing all of these road shows. They met a lot of different women. They did a lot of media conferences also. And then they realized how common domestic violence was, but it was mostly talked from the lens of dowry harassment, which is why even the law actually came into existence. But then, how do we challenge the culture itself? Of course, law legalities are at a stage when somebody actually wants to file a case, or somebody wants to fight that battle legally. But it's so hard for, and that's what we sort of saw, that it actually is super hard for women to actually firstly admit it, that they are being abused, and then actually say something to somebody, because that's also embarrassment and brings dishonor to family. And then third, go through that whole rigor of the process. That is like a journey in itself. And the fourth is like, what is the alternative? Where do you go after that? So because of all of this lack of understanding in the mainstream, um, we realized that we need to make it a cultural problem. Like, we need to understand where the culture of violence is actually coming from, and why are, firstly, we could not talk to the perpetrator, because that became like the hardest thing for us to sort of enter. Then we realized that who do we talk to? We talk to the victim, or survivor, who wants to actually come out, or may not want to come out, because that also adds to, of course, when we've talked about it, how that is in itself is um, like a challenge for the victim. So because of the lack of support, lack of resources and understanding, all of these things actually emerged during our research, during our work in the communities. And we realized that the bystander is whom we will be addressing this particular campaign to. While a lot of work happens within the communities, the families, this is the main one simple action that somebody can go and interrupt an act of violence. If they hear something, they see something, is where the whole idea actually started. Bell bajao, the whole concept is ring the bell when you hear domestic violence. It may see, and that's the whole point, that how do you make it so simple for a bystander to intervene, because that is another daunting task for bystanders. Even in the current, I'm sure like Madhumita can add more to why people do not intervene and how that becomes a challenge. But culturally, we only speak out when there are certain other, I'd say, moral deviances when we see it. But this is not a problem that we see from a moralistic lens. Domestic violence is normal. It's okay. It's between them. Because of that kind of mindset, we realize that we have to work with that, or flip that culture, which actually enables that. And hence, Bell Bajao became Bell Bajao, and then we did all of these TVCs and ads and the whole campaign. And it took us a lot of like time, many years, to kind of bring it into the public consciousness, to sort of make domestic violence, or understand domestic violence from the crime lens. So yeah, that's where it kind of started. And coming from a communication understanding, you always go with one single big message and then you break it down. But the single message was the most important, and hence we feel that was effective as well.
Thank you, Anika. What I'm getting is also that it's not only the large actions that make a difference, but even perhaps a small, simple action can make a difference to diffusing a situation that's happening in the moment. Before I go into my next question, I'd just like to remind those of you who are watching this on Facebook that you can send in your questions either by typing them in the comments section. We also have a Google Doc if you wish to send in your questions to us anonymously. Please send in your questions and we'll share them with our panelists and have them answered during the course of the next 20 minutes or so. Madhumita, let's talk about the workplace. Why is Diversity Dialogues has just released a booklet on domestic violence and the Indian workplace, and we've been talking about how it's seen culturally as a matter that's as an intimate matter or something within the family. Why then is why did you choose to work on this topic specifically, and does the timing of this ebook hold some sort of significance?
Right. Ranjita, I'm going to go back a little bit and sort of also say that as I'm hearing this conversation today, the thing that comes to my mind is I think each one of us are bystanders. Because if 1 in 3 women are going through this, and that's what the statistics say, and we've not even explored what's happening with the LGBT community, what's happening with men, what's happening with people with disability, many of the other sections in the society, there is definitely a lot more. That's happening. So each of us, whether we know it or not, are bystanders, right? And I do want to narrate an experience around this that when I started my career, and this is more than a decade back. I was this HR professional and working with a company. I had somebody sitting next to me, this person who was working quite well and all of that. And suddenly she decided to get married, went on marital leave, and then came back. And every day for the next about 9 months, she had scars in her hand. Okay. And she lost enormous amount of weight. She was always confused. There was a certain fear, there was a certain anxiety that she was holding, right? And I have to tell you, I was sitting next to her. We were colleagues working together, and I never realized there was anything wrong. you know that I consider myself as a person with a fair degree of empathy, but I somehow did not. I asked her what the bruises are about. She told me, oh, I was cutting something and all that, and I was like, oh, you're negligent at work, you're also negligent. I didn't tell her that, but in my mind I was thinking, okay, she's not performing at work, maybe she's also negligent at home. And that's what happens. So I was a bystander. Whether I chose to do something or not about it, I was still a bystander, right? And then of course, it came to me. She never opened up. She decided to leave the organization. At that point, it came to me from another colleague, and this was the HR leader of the organization, who said, by the way, this person's leaving and this is the reason, and the person's also going through a divorce and all of that. So this is how it plays out. So for us to say that this is a private matter is something that we need to question, because the person sitting next to us is possibly going through something we don't know. Secondly, I think it's been spoken about multiple times in today's conversation that the person goes through fear. There is anxiety, there is a drop in performance, there is absenteeism, there is a lot of all that plays out, which directly in many ways, even if I don't want to look at it from a consideration of being a good person or wanting to do the right thing for the society, it's also impacting workplace productivity, right? So there is a direct correlation between workplace productivity and this. And there is a lot of studies which say that. I mean, there is a study which is done by KPMG for Vodafone across their markets, and what it actually indicates is that the workplace impact is literally about 2.2 to about 9.7. That's the range, $1 billion for workplaces per annum, as a result of the domestic violence and that what is experienced, right? So there have been many instances like this in my work over a period of time. I've seen it with the LGBT space, I've seen it with persons with disability, and the common thread that I saw was that none of them would actually tell their workplace about it, because they always thought that they would never get an answer there, that there is a stigma associated, that we probably will end up losing our job there as well, right? And which is one of the reasons, I mean, this has been staying with me for many many years, and which is one of the reasons we decided that we need to talk about this. Because if diversity and inclusion is about working with the LGBT community, is about working with persons with disability, is about working with women, and you're looking at increasing your representation and providing an inclusive workplace to all of these communities, all of them are also vulnerable to domestic violence, and you can't completely sort of exclude that, right? And that was the reason the guide came into existence, to say that can workplaces do something about it, should workplaces play a role. And coming back, I think when you talk about financial empowerment, one of the reasons also is that a lot of these vulnerable groups often don't have that, right? So how do you enable that? And that can be enabled by workplaces, that can be enabled by that ecosystem as well. So how do they play a role? And that's why it became important for us to put out a guide. And I do want to say that, you know, there are studies which say that, like, there is a study by SHRM which says that about 60% of organizations don't have any policy around domestic violence, but 19% of them have had instances where there have been people who have come and said, who have reported. Also, what if the domestic violence walks into office? You have somebody stalking at the workplace. You have somebody on official emails constantly sort of stalking a person constantly. Then what do? Then there is workplace safety at risk as well. So that's why the reason, workplaces need to be able to look at it. And that's why the guide, so that, we put that out there and more workplaces can take to it.
Thank you. This is a question for both of you. What is really the role of a bystander? And we talked about active bystanders and passive bystanders. For both of these, what is the role that they can play? Madhumita?
Right. So I am going to again come to it from a workplace standpoint. And the reason I'm choosing to do that is because, that's the area that I'm most comfortable and will talk basis my experience. If you're a manager or a team member, what can you really do when somebody approaches you, talks about it, etc.? Now, at one level, the bystander role in my mind is also to sort of make your own workplace safe, first of all, because if you're not doing that and you're being abusive at some level, then that's not going to work. So how are you bringing in a culture of respect? How are you making it a safe space for people to be able to speak about? Because otherwise, people will not open up, not only on this, on many other things. So that becomes sort of the first rule. And the second rule tied into that is zero tolerance for any kind of abuse or abusive behavior at the workplace, because that's how you start and you provide a safe space for people to be able to do it, right? Moving on further, what can you do? One is definitely have an access to resources, which is, for example, during especially the COVID times, given there has been the blur between the workplace and the home. I mean, both have at some level gotten integrated. There are companies which put up a simple slide saying these are the resources which are available, which managers use in meetings and all of that. So to be able to talk about that, call out resources, is the first thing. The second thing is at many levels to ensure confidentiality, specifically if somebody is opening up to you, coming out to you and all of that, to ensure that this is not information, and really practice that in essence as well. Saying where will it go? If it will go to an HR person, then who is that person to whom it will go, right? The third and the most important thing I feel is having empathy. So to ask the person, how can I help you? How can I be there for you? Believing that that person has the autonomy to sort of decide, right? And not making yourself as the figure who will decide for the person, but to ask with that certain level of empathy without any kind of statements around, it's your fault and you can work on this relationship and, you can do this and you can do that, or saying that these things happen and it doesn't matter. So to be able to provide that space of empathy and acknowledgement, because you possibly in this cycle will be one of the few players who will also give that to the person, that reassurance that what you're saying, I believe you, I hear you and all of that, right? And then to spend time saying future around future safety planning. That's something as an individual team member, as a manager, you can do, which is to ask questions around saying, oh, if you're going through this, then who will you call? Who will be your first point of contact? How are you maintaining your documents? How are you maintaining your electronic safety? So helping the person doing some level of safety planning. And I'm talking about just managers and the manager population at this point in time. What can the larger organization do? I think I will come to. But as an individual bystander, as a manager, as a team member, these are some of the things that you can do.
Anika, if we were to look at the role of a bystander beyond the workplace, what are some of the things that we could do?
As an individual who's not connected to NGOs, or who doesn't um, know about who doesn't know a lot about the services, or how the whole thing works, the first thing for any individual is that firstly you need to listen and not assume. So there are these very little tips, but they're very important, because what will happen is once you start assuming for the person. So here I'll give an example saying, yes, the world outside may be unsafe, but your homes are safe. So you need to go home. And it could be now, that could be a relative, that could be a friend, that could be a coworker, that could be your student as well. So this assumption that the home is safe, this is an example, but all of these assumptions without actually understanding somebody's reality is a no-go. So you have to firstly not assume and listen, and actually listen. So, and you don't have to immediately start dispensing advice. Ye kar lo, ye kar lo, ye kar lo. Basis what? Because even to give that advice, you firstly need to, you yourself need to be sensitized enough. You need to know what exactly is the process. And honestly, no two cases are the same. So hence you cannot say that, oh, I have this training, so I know what to do. That's just absolutely something that we would discourage. Listen to people. What Manmita said, that just having that empathy is important. The other thing where during the lockdown is something that we saw, and we all know how the cases really sort of shot up during the lockdown. Everybody's in the family spaces, which were supposed to be safe, but clearly not. Uh, how do you sort of create that communication bridge between somebody who's facing it and somebody who can just listen to them? So we realized that texting, people who had access to mobile phones, there were very young women who are like in college school, high school. They used to text each other, or they used to sometimes text even an organization like Breakthrough, because they had access to the internet space. So we realized that phone calls were dangerous. So text became easier, and also because they could be documented. So that is something that we need to sort of keep in mind. I'm talking about specifically during the lockdown, but even during this pandemic, there is social distancing which is required. So ensure that we use text wisely. Ensure we are not giving too much advice, and then resources, again, same thing. If you do not have access to resources, look for them. Look for people who can help you. Look for all of this information. Sometimes a simple Google search could help, and that could give you a list of things. List of helpline numbers, list of resources which are maybe hyper local. And the other thing is, all of this is when you hear it like second hand. But what if you witness something? And the thing is, like I said, you may witness something which is physical in nature. Sometimes it could be somebody yelling. You could also witness somebody trying to insult or berate a woman in front of you, and you feel, this is normal, but you don't know the kind of impact it has on somebody. So even understanding those little cues is important, that domestic violence needn't just be physical, and we need to constantly talk about different forms of control and abuse, where that we need to start picking on, not just as individuals, even collectively as a society. That's something that is something we would definitely push for. And having the culture of empathy and of understanding. And I mean, or are we only going to understand somebody who's just because she's my friend, I'm going to listen to her, but that's a stranger, I'm not going to care about? No, you need to have empathy for the two of them equally. And of course, you can't spoon feed empathy, but that's something that we need to build on. And the last bit that we also realize that if it's that bad, you have to intervene. Many times, what stops a bystander from intervention? Um, there are lots of reasons. One is indifference, something very common. Apathy, doesn't matter to me. Um, fear, fear of getting involved or injured or getting harmed, basically, or insulted by the person who is uh, perpetuating the violence, and also somebody who's not ready to actually step out. So all of these things actually add up to a person who has to single-handedly do it. So what we're also pushing for is you collectivize, you talk to other friends, you talk to other family members who you feel would be with you, and intervene in numbers because there's strength in numbers. That's something we've seen a lot of young people in our work areas doing that because the adults were not listening to them. So then they got together, like 6, 7 young people got together. They went to the person's house who was getting abused by her father. And they just wanted to sort of give them this idea that, yeah, we know what you're doing. So that also made it a little better. So all of these are little things people could, they may sound little, but they have larger impact. But these are some things we've seen that have worked. And yeah, I'm sure there's a lot more that has to be done.
Yeah. I do want to add, 2 points here, which is one is around self-care for the bystander as well. So if you're somebody who's doing this, and you're being approached and it's the first time, it can be a very overwhelming experience for you also. So how do you take care of yourself? I think that is one. The second is sometimes, at least in my experience, there is a feeling that people hold that if they were to intervene, they would actually make the situation worse, right? So I hold myself to some of the points I think Anika so rightly made. There is also that, and I feel that not speaking up and just being silent and just watching it will always sort of, I mean, speaking up is important, so give yourself that permission in different ways to bring that, if not anything else, to diffuse the situation, to distract. So figure out different ways of intervening, but intervening is important, intervening is essential. So that feeling that I will worsen the situation is the second one. The third is sometimes we believe we can be everything. So believing where your boundaries can be drawn. If you're a manager, for example, or a person who does not have experience in counseling, not to take on that role of giving advice and then counseling and listening for 2 hours and all of that, because it's going to also not work for you very well. But to know where do you want to stop, where will you, how, what is the role you will play. It could be just simply, I will access you to the right resources, and that could be great enough, right? But to just figure out what is the role you would play. So I just thought I'd add that.
Thank you. And Anika spoke of collective action. Madhumita, if we were to talk about systems that are actually set up to be supportive, what can organizations do to support anybody in the workplace who may be experiencing domestic abuse?
Right. So I think there are a few things that an organization can definitely do. The first one is to break the taboo. And how do you break the taboo? You break the taboo by talking about it. So having sessions around it, not only for women at the workplace, for the men as well, for others, for people identifying from any gender, any sexuality, any background, to do it at a holistic scale. And to talk about it means that this is something that the organization recognizes happens and we're giving voice to it, right? So it begins there. And I think it's important to do that. The second, like I said, is information and helplines, and having that very handy and available to everybody. So that, and I don't mean a workplace as in this, this whole big ecosystem with 10,000 employees. Even 5 employees is a workplace because it's a place where one goes to work, right? So do you have information? Do you have helplines? Do you have, these organization lists that somebody can then refer to? Because again, that's giving voice to the entire thing. The third is in terms of, is your existing mental health support in the organization, your existing employee assistance program, if you have one, or a counselor, are they sort of aware of this, trained, equipped to manage this, equipped to handle this? That's something to also check for. Then there is the whole angle of reasonable accommodation that I would bring in, which is to say that, can you offer safety leave? For example, if somebody is wanting to get out of that situation and needs some time off to be able to plan their life and so on, so are you giving them that kind of time that's there? Can you offer them support systems? And this could be in terms of legal support, for example. If an employee complains to you and says that, listen, I want to get out of this situation, can you transfer me to a different place? Can you look at ways and means of making that happen for employees, right? And also to consider then, if there is temporary accommodation available. A lot of organizations have guest houses, have spaces of themselves. If you can provide that and access to that, that's something to look at. The last bit of it, and which I think is very important, and all these things are basis what resources the organization has, but this one is something that's important, which is to have consideration on performance. Because as we've spoken so far, it is a very difficult period for the person, right? So to be able to consider that and to be able to hold that, and companies, can look at saying, for this period, we'll rate you in a certain way, we look at it, we'll protect your career, but that becomes like very, very important to do. At that time, if you're also adding on to the stress, right, then that's just adding to the system, that's problematic. So that is something that you could choose to do. The last bit of it which I want to say is to decide that, for example, if there is some employee, there is a prospective hire who you found out through records, etc., background verification, is somebody who is a perpetrator of domestic violence, and that's something that is proven, because that legal proceeding is on, then are you going to hire such a person? What's your take on that? Because it's not just on this side, right? It's also on the other side. So what are some of the steps you're taking there? What are you going to do about that? That's also something that organizations can look at. So there's a whole lot of things that companies and organizations and workplaces, no matter what their sizes, can do.
We have a question from a viewer, and also something that I wanted to ask both of you. It's about, this being a topic that can possibly bring up quite a bit of shame, trauma, and a lot of vulnerability. How does one, if you think that someone around you may be experiencing domestic abuse, how do you actually bring this conversation up with respect and sensitivity? How do you begin to intuit when to back off and to say, hey, maybe this person's not ready to talk about it yet? Anika?
Yeah, and this is something which is actually a barrier when it comes to bystander intervention. And sadly, it's something which is very, very commonplace. The Again, going back to the idea of who has the agency in that situation. The person who's actually going through the harassment, abuse, are we going to take decisions on their behalf, firstly? No matter whatever situation it may be, in the end, who is it that we are thinking about? Are we thinking about ourselves? Are we thinking about the family or the space that they're in? Or are we putting the person who needs all the support in center? So that prioritization is important. So we need to understand, hear them out, and also let them figure out how do they want to take the process forward. What you can be a facilitator, you can be a support, in terms of, if there's financial support needed, if there is emotional support needed, you could do all of that. But in the end, who decides what is best for them is the person who's actually in the whole space. The other thing is, we also think, but they are so hassled, they're not thinking right, they're not making the right decision. Again, let's stop infantilizing people, especially with women, because they're already being dehumanized at home. So let's not add more to it, right? So rather than that, you approach it from a very support sort of space, where you say that, let's do what you want to do. If you need me to find out some information, I would get that information for you. If you need me to find out some accommodation, I would do that. Or if you need a job, maybe I can, talk to my circles and, then get you out. Because there is shame and honor and all of that linked to, and actually that cuts across all forms of violence against women. Um, the challenge becomes that who do we then pander to, or who then do we try to save in that case? Is something as simple as hurting community sentiments, are they more important, or family sentiments, or is the individual more important in that case? So we, from a very rights-based approach, we need to go and see what the person, what they want. So this is at least like what I feel Madhurita, please.
Yeah. Yeah, recognizing somewhere what the indicators are. I think in addition to, so for example, if you see somebody with regular bruises or scars, right? Somebody who is co- there's fear, there's anxiety written on the face, there's a certain sense of loss and feeling that I'm lost, I don't know, there is confusion. Also the person's trying to withdraw, is trying to be isolated, is not being open, is not being transparent about their life or any of these things. And in a workplace, sudden dip in performance, absenteeism, presentism playing up, these are additional factors only for the workplace. If any of that is happening, I think irrespective of whether it is domestic violence or not, right, the as somebody who's a well-wisher, who's observing it and who's a bystander, which means I'm witnessing this happening in front of me, my thing would be to reach out and say, and the rest of it is pretty much what Anika said, which is to say, I'm here to help, I'm concerned about you, what's happening with you, how can I help, and then leave the person to tell you and believe the person when they tell you in which way they like you to help, instead of deciding what you need to do. So that's pretty much some of the signs that one can look at, and then yeah.
And of course, there's a lot more information on both the signs and what you as a bystander can do in Diversity Dialogue's book, Domestic Violence in the Indian Workplace. It's on our portal, and the link will be shared in the comments as well if you'd like to explore this topic deeper. I'd like to just close this panel with one last question to Anika. Anika, you work in the space of communications and digital campaigns. Do you think that we need to, relook the narrative we've built around domestic violence all of these years?
Always. Communication, while it's taken for granted, the challenge is that it's the most important thing or the most important thing that needs very solid strategies also. Because while the challenge, I can give an example of language. What kind of language are we using when we're talking about domestic violence? Um, you know, uh, in English, we still have all of these big terms that we now have normalized using it, like even the word normalize. But in different languages that people speak, at least in our country or in our region, there are lots of languages firstly, and how do people communicate in that language also? So because I understand Hindi, I would give an example of वो बहुत परेशान है. Now that parishani can also mean that I'm just generally very sad or I am being abused. So the word parishan is being used to express all of that. Or otherwise there is a word in Hindi which is shoshan. So now she's being harassed and violated. Now that's a very heavy word, right? So now what I'm actually trying to get at is understanding the language, and not just in terms of like literal language, but the message itself is something that we really, really need to work on. The other bit is that when it comes to communication, we also need to understand that we live in because I work in digital, so I keep on pushing for the whole understanding the innovation in digital spaces as well. I'll give you an example how NCW recently got all of these reports of cases of domestic violence were through text messages and WhatsApp. Um, let's not forget how technology can, while it has its cons and it can create a problem for the person who's going through it, it also provides a way out. So let's also think about those strategies which kind of work. Like I said, those young girls who were a part of that school ka WhatsApp group were able to intervene in an abusive situation when there was no police in the village. Like there was nobody that could have gone to help out. But then looking at these smaller technological innovations and communication is something which is important. And the last thing is the narratives built around women. That is something which we've seen. It's not new. We live in a patriarchal society. All of this is something that at least people here in this group are already aware of. But how do we create those alternative narratives? We love to counter stuff like, and a small example, don't rape. Yes, that is a counter. Or stop war. These are counters. But what is the alternative is something which is not being imagined. But that doesn't mean that those alternatives do not exist. But they have become the exception and not the norm. So we need to create norms out of exceptions where we are not normalizing violence. We're not normalizing the language of violence also. Um, and then we have to have all of these strategies, which are, while they look at an individual, they also need to look at the broader culture and norm. So this is where we sort of work. And I think pop culture may, there have been some really, really good examples of how people are challenging it. Some, like something as simple as a film like Thappad, like a Hindi film like Thappad, which created a certain kind of conversation dialogue around domestic violence and how we're all complicit in the silence around it. But like I said, this is something we have to constantly push, even as individuals and organizations both. So that's where I would want to.
Yeah.
Thank you.
If I can
Yeah.
just add, Ranjita, and I'm going to say this because it just comes to me. We use this term, spare the rod, spoil the child, like it's an everyday term, right? We think that's absolutely okay. So in our everyday language, I mean, to sort of look at it and say that, I mean, that in its own way is talking about violence being okay. So that just comes to me, and I wanted to put that out there. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This is so interesting, and I wish we could continue this conversation. We are running out of time, and for our viewers, if you'd like to know more about the work Madhumita and Anika are doing, you can look up both Diversity Dialogues and Breakthrough on Facebook and Twitter and other social media. So do look up their work. There's a lot of wonderful work they're doing in this space. So before we, thank you so much, Anika and Madhumita, for giving us your time and helping us really look at what is the role of a bystander. I think one thing that that clearly stood out for me in this conversation is the idea of no action being too small or too insignificant. And it's better to take a tiny, tiny step than not to take any at all. So thank you so much for sharing that with us. Before we wrap up on this symposium, we've got a few questions from our audience that I'd like to ask the panelists. The first one is for Anuradha. Anuradha, are you here?
Yes, I am.
Yes. The question is, what are the changes that need to be initiated with men to address the issue of domestic abuse?
I think Kamlaji started off, I mean, she broached the topic about the fact that since men are part of the problem, they have to be part of the solution. So I think, it's, as I said, you have to start young because, changing mindsets is what really is going to make the difference. And if we start teaching from a young age, children, that there is no difference between a girl, boy, or any other gender, respect and equality, I think that really is a starting point. And we also need to do this through the education system. We need to look at how we are teaching and what we are teaching our children. So for example, history is his story. We don't hear women's stories. We don't hear about women who have played part in history. So we need to have those stories also being told. When our books are telling us that our mothers are at home cooking and our fathers are going out, we need to change those narratives. We need books that say that mothers and fathers both are going out to work, both are looking after children. So to break those stereotypes that are generated through our education system. So I think that, at every level, whether it is from the family, whether it is at the educational level, whether it's our laws that are now, there are many laws still in the books which are discriminatory towards women. We need to change those laws. For example, the guardianship law is that a woman is the guardian of her child only in the absence of the father, which is, I mean, ridiculous. So we need to change those. And attitudinal change is what is going to bring about difference. And I'd like to say that, we have been working with men and boys in the field areas that we're working with women. And, you want like Kamalaji says, they are also dehumanized. I mean, it's not like children, boys are born to abuse, or people are born to abuse. It's all, it's like, you know, it's interesting because we've been working with young men, and you know, when we bring up this topic about sexual harassment, where, you know, every corner place will have a few boys who will pass comments at girls going by, when we process this with them and talk about how does a woman feel and what is the impact of that on a child's on a woman's life, they start thinking, and it's like they haven't thought about it before. It's almost as if this is what was expected of them, this is what they did, but they didn't realize what their actions meant. That it meant that a girl will stop getting educated, it meant a girl will not be able to go to school, it meant a girl would lose self-confidence, it might mean that a girl might kill herself even. So these were the consequences that they never thought about. So when you point that out, there is a change in behavior. And so I think that that's where we really need to work at the ground level with young men and boys. And, you know, I started thinking about that. It's so important to work with boys, because one of the earliest experiences I had when I went to schools and I was talking, you know, we were doing gender exercises. And after we did this exercise, we were debriefing, and there were girls and boys in the class. And this young boy, he must have been about 14. He said, you know, this has been such a change, a turning point for me, because this young girl who I've been sitting next to since I was in nursery, I didn't realize the kind of discrimination she's had to face. I just thought that this is how it was. So we need to make that change. We need to work with young boys to change that thinking. And we also need to work with young girls to say, you can do it. And that, you know, you have a right, because it works, you know, both ways. If the girl doesn't change, if women don't change, and we have been working with young women a lot more. And I've found that, you know, whilst younger women are much more confident, much more, you know, wanting to assert their rights, young boys have not caught up with that. And there is more and more conflict happening. So I think working with men and boys is absolutely essential. And we need to start right from the very beginning.
The next question is for Madhumita. Madhumita, if you could answer, the question is, what do you do when a survivor doesn't want to seek support or take action for any reason? What do you as a bystander do when a survivor doesn't want to take your help or take action for whatever reason?
You still say, in my own experience, and you know, whatever, you still listen, you still allow the person to share, you still allow the person, let the person know that there are resources available in case the person chose to. Like Anuradha said, I think sometime in her panel, that you give the person all the different options that are available. You make them understand that, and then you let them take their own decision. You don't sort of, the job of a manager, a bystander, you know, is not that I have to at any cost sort of, you know, make sure that the person takes a decision which I think is the most appropriate to take, because that person may be going through a lot in life and will take their own decision. I mean, financial considerations, multiple others, right? But to assure the person that you're there, right, I think that is what is possibly the most important thing that I would think one needs to really do, so that the person has a safe space where they get that acknowledgement, that validation, and if they ever choose to, they know where to go, how to do it, and all of those things. Right, so I think that is where I would think. Also, if the person's a neighbor or somebody whom, I mean, can you diffuse the situation in some way? Can you distract? Can you sort of pull the person out once in a while, or whatever can you do? That is something that one can also consider. Of course, it is different from case to case, so I don't want to generalize this and put us out as, you know, go ahead and sort of put your foot there, but there could be situations where you possibly can.
Thank you. So I also have this question. This is a question that's coming for Aishwarya. Aishwarya, this is from the point of view of the survivor who's asking, what if the abuser doesn't seem to agree that my experience is one of abuse and brushes off my anxiety as a joke?
I think that's also a form of abuse, you know, and that does happen so often. It's unbelievable how often we see, isme kya hai? You know, that's a common thing we hear from the abuser and people around. So Yes, it does happen. What can we do? It's like I mentioned earlier, it's important to recognize how it's making you feel, how it is affecting you at an individual level, what it's doing to your self-worth, or to your sense of self, basically, and then going from there, because there's a good chance that other people won't recognize. So the first step is recognizing that it's doing what it's doing to you, and then trying to get help or speak to someone for support, and making further plans, taking further action.
One last question before we wrap up for this evening. There's a question from a viewer who asks, and perhaps Anika, you could answer this. There's a teenager, an 18-year-old girl who's facing sexual abuse within the family and emotional violence from the parents. What can be done? How can the situation be improved for her? And what can I as a bystander do?
18, right? Because
it says 18, yes.
Yeah, because POXO, yeah. Again, these are some cases that have actually come out to us. I would not want to comment right away, because then I also would want to give the right answer to this. But I would actually ask other panelists to kind of share. The first thing is, having taking all screenshots, taking recordings, having the proofs in the first place, because that's the hardest thing to prove, especially when it's a parent or a family member. The other is, we need to also see, because if she's dependent on the family financially, then it becomes a challenge. So a lot of times we've seen people create like temporary accommodations for the person to come and live in, and slowly, if they can get any kind of job or vocation. But this is, like I said, I would want to be very sure about this answer, come up with the proper guidelines or process. But if somebody else could, maybe an Anuradha could suggest.
I don't think
Yes,
I don't think there's a foolproof answer for this, because as is said, each situation is unique. So what is that person's access to resource and support is most important. And what does that person want to do? I think that, everything starts with what the 18-year-old wants to do, and then how you can support her in doing that. So I think the answer always lies with the survivor herself. And our role is to say, okay, fine, if this is what you want to do, these are the ways in which you can do it, and this is the support that we can get. And to try and identify, who are the people around her who can give her that support. I don't know who, like, for example, we're saying there's this 18-year-old, but who am I as a bystander? Am I a friend? Am I a relative? Because that also will determine the amount of support I can give. If I happen to be just somebody who has absolutely no connection with that person, then the amount of support I can give, the kind of support will be very different. But if I'm a relative, I could give even more support in terms of even bringing them home. Like if it's a friend, I can offer my place. There are many things. So it really is it depends on A, what the survivor wants, and B, who I am in relation to her, and C, to always have the resources that she can access, to be able to put her in touch with, groups that are working on this, protection officers, so that she is able to get the options and not take a hasty decision, because we cannot make that decision for her. She has to take it, and we have to be there for her. So I would always say that, there is no set answer as to what you can do. It depends on what she's asking for, and and to be there, most importantly, to be there to support her, to tell her you're there for her and what you can do and how you can connect her to resources. But an 18-year-old being abused, there are laws. Whether she wants to go into a legal system, most of these young girls don't want to go and register cases. They want out. They want to be able to. So what does she want? Again, we come back to that same answer. What does she want, and how can we support her to get there?
Thank you, Anuradha. So if there's one common thread I'm picking up from all of the conversations we've had earlier today is that it's important to center the experience of the victim, and that any support needs to be offered with respect for their autonomy and their choice and what they'd like to do. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us, for spending close to 3.5 hours with us talking about this very important and difficult topic. Before we close, I'd just like to share a few resources. Of course, I've already talked about the booklet by Diversity Dialogues that's up on our portal. Please do look it up. We also have a series of pieces on domestic abuse and mental health experts and legal options. That's up on our portal as well. This is a series compiled by Shakti that we've put up on the portal. So please do look those up too. We have a workplace mental health program that focuses on mental health, how our mental health impacts how we show up in our workplaces, and what organizations can do to support people who have mental health issues and to make the organization itself much more inclusive to everyone. So if you'd like to know more about that, please get in touch. We'd be very happy to tell you how we can help. We also have a fortnightly newsletter that touches upon many different aspects of mental health. So the link to sign up for that will be shared on the comments. And of course, we will continue talking about mental health over the next few weeks and months. So follow us on social media to hear about the next event, the next conversation, the next Facebook Live we'll be doing. Before I close, once again, thank you to everyone who signed in. And I saw quite a few comments on the Facebook feed when I checked in a little while ago. Thank you so much for your enthusiastic participation and for your questions. And to every single one of our panelists, thank you for coming, for spending 3.5 hours with us and making this discussion so rich and insightful. Thank you all.